Hey guys, imagine this. 40,000 years ago, a bunch of hardy souls stumble across a frozen land bridge, chasing mammoths in dreams, only to watch it vanish underwater, stranding them in a vast, untamed continent. Little did they know, they'd build empires, face apocalypses, and endure the ultimate cosmic joke of history: survival against all odds. Buckle up, because this is the epic, absurd, and heartbreaking saga of Native Americans, from Ice Age wanderers to 21st century warriors. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. The beginning. Or should I say, the accidental arrival. Picture it, around 40,000 BC, while the rest of humanity is busy inventing fire and arguing over cave paintings in Eurasia, a group of intrepid Asians decides to take a really long walk. They're following herds of woolly mammoths across the Bering Land Bridge, a frozen highway connecting Siberia to Alaska. Why? Because why not? Food's scarce, winters are brutal, and hey, adventure calls. But here's the irony. They cross this bridge, set foot in the Americas, and poof, rising sea levels courtesy of a warming planet swallow it whole by about 11,000 BC. Trapped, no going back. It's like booking a one-way ticket to paradise. Only paradise is full of saber-toothed tigers, giant sloths, and an endless buffet of megafauna that could stomp you flat. These first migrants, whom we'll call the Paleo-Indians for that fancy archaeological flair, aren't just wandering aimlessly. Oh no, they're survivors in the truest sense, adapting to a world that's equal parts wonder and nightmare. They spread out like wildfire across the continent, from the icy tundras of Alaska down to the lush forests of what would become Canada and the United States, and even further south into Mexico and beyond. By 20,000 BC, they've got Clovis points, these wickedly sharp stone tools named after a site in New Mexico where they were found. Imagine crafting a spear tip so precise it can take down a mammoth that's basically a walking tank. But survival's pain? It's etched in every hunt. One wrong move and you're mammoth chow. Families huddle around fires, sharing stories of near misses, while the wind howls like a vengeful spirit. Fast forward a bit to around 15,000 BC, and these folks are diversifying. Some head east, hugging the coasts, others venture inland. Genetic evidence. Yeah. Modern science loves to poke at ancient bones, shows waves of migration, maybe even boat trips along the Pacific. Drop a comment below if you've ever kayaked in rough seas. Now imagine doing it with stone tools and no GPS. Absurd, right? But they did it, populating the Americas faster than you can say manifest destiny. Wait, that's jumping ahead, but spoiler, irony incoming. By 10,000 BC, the Ice Age is wrapping up, and with it goes the megafauna party. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, all vanishing in a mass extinction that's part climate change, part overhunting by these clever humans. The pain of survival kicks in hard here. Diets shift from big game to smaller prey, berries, nuts, and whatever the land coughs up. Communities form, semi-permanent settlements pop up. In places like Monteverde in Chile, dated to around 14,500 BC, we find evidence of huts, tools, and even medicinal plants. These people aren't just enduring, they're innovating. But oh, the absurdity, building a life in a world that's constantly changing, where one drought could wipe out your clan. Let's zoom in on North America around 8,000 BC. The archaic period begins, a fancy term for we're getting smarter at this survival gig. Hunter-gatherers refine their skills, creating atlatls, spear throwers that give you superhero arm strength. In the Great Basin, folks are weaving baskets so tight they hold water. Imagine the first time someone realizes, hey, I can store seeds in this. Revolutionary, but the pain? Constant migration following seasons, dodging floods, fires, and famines. Families lose loved ones to simple infections. No antibiotics, just herbs and hope. It's a world where every sunrise is a victory, every sunset a sigh of relief. Around 5,000 BC, something magical or absurdly practical happens: agriculture. In Mesoamerica, people start domesticating maize from teosinte, a wild grass that looks nothing like corn. It's like turning a weed into gold. Squash, beans, chilies follow. The Three Sisters farming system emerges. Corn for height, beans for nitrogen, squash for ground cover. Genius. But the irony? It ties you to the land, making you vulnerable to crop failures. In the Southwest, the basket maker culture thrives, building pit houses and storing food in cliffside granaries. Survival's pain is in the labor, backbreaking work under scorching suns, praying to spirits for rain that might never come. By 3000 BC, we're seeing the rise of complex societies. In the Ohio Valley, the Adena culture builds massive earthen mounds. Think pyramids, but made of dirt. Why? Burial sites, ceremonies, status symbols. Imagine hauling tons of soil in baskets because your chief says so. Absurd hierarchy emerging. Further south, in Poverty Point, Louisiana, a massive complex of ridges and mounds forms a semicircle over a mile wide. Trade networks stretch from the Gulf to the Great Lakes. Shells, copper, exotic stones. These people are connected, trading ideas as much as goods. But the sarcasm here, all this sophistication, and yet one bad flood from the Mississippi, and it's back to square one. The pain of rebuilding, mourning the lost, it's the eternal cycle. Let's not forget the Pacific Northwest around 2000 BC. The Chinook, Haida, Tlingit, they're mastering the seas with cedar canoes that could rival Viking ships. Totem poles rise, potlatches, these extravagant feasts where chiefs give away wealth to gain status. Ironic, isn't it? In a world of scarcity, showing off by depleting resources, but it builds alliances, ensures survival through sharing. Whaling expeditions, harpooning a 40-ton beast from a wooden boat. One mistake, and you're fish food. The stories told around fires must have been epic. Remember when Uncle got swallowed by the whale? Good times. Shifting east to the woodland period, around 1000 BC, pottery revolutionizes storage. Bow and arrow make hunting a breeze. In the northeast, Iroquoian and Algonquian groups form villages, cultivating the Three Sisters. Longhouses shelter extended families. Cozy, but imagine the drama of living with 50 relatives. No privacy, constant negotiations. The pain? Raids from neighbors over resources. Warfare enters the scene, not full scale, but enough to keep you vigilant. Drop a comment if you've ever had a family feud. Now amplify that with spears. Mesoamerica heats up by 1200 BC with the Olmecs, the mother culture of later civilizations. Giant basalt heads up to 10 feet tall, carved and transported without wheels or beasts of burden. Absurd effort for art or divine mandates. They build ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo, with ball courts where games might end in sacrifice. The irony, playing for your life, literally. Jaguar motifs everywhere, shamans transforming into beasts. Survival's pain in the jungles, diseases, venomous critters, unpredictable rains. Yet they thrive, influencing Maya, Zapotecs, and more. By 500 BC, the Maya are rising in the Yucatan and Guatemala. City-states like Tikal, with pyramids piercing the canopy. Hieroglyphs tell tales of kings, wars, astronomy. They map the stars better than Europeans for centuries. But the sarcasm, all this knowledge, and they collapse around 900 AD from overpopulation, deforestation, droughts, building an empire on shaky ground, literal and figurative. The pain of watching your world crumble, fleeing to smaller settlements. Back north, the Hopewell culture in the Midwest, 200 BC to 500 AD. Mounds galore, trade exploding, obsidian from the Rockies, mica from the Appalachians, effigy pipes carved like animals, ceremonial burials with treasures. It's like a prehistoric Amazon.com, but delivery by foot. Absurd distances for bling. Survival, balancing trade with territorial squabbles. Famines hit, diseases spread along routes. In the southwest, the Anasazi, or ancestral Puebloans, around 100 AD, cliff dwellings like Mesa Verde, multi-story pueblos, kivas for rituals, irrigation canals defying the desert, corn grinding all day, women's backs aching from metates. The irony, engineering marvels in a land that hates you, with flash floods and arid spells. By 1300 AD, they abandoned sites, drought, warfare, resource depletion, pain of migration, leaving ancestors behind. The Mississippian culture blooms around 800 AD in the southeast. Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, a city of 20,000, bigger than London at the time. Monk's Mound, 100 feet tall, built by hand. Ball games, chunky, rolling stones and betting lives. Chiefdoms with divine rulers. Trade in copper, shells. But the absurdity, mound-building slaves toiling under whips, while elites feast, collapse by 1400 AD, over-farming, deforestation, floods, survival's brutal joke, build high, fall hard. Up in the Arctic, the Thule culture, ancestors of Inuit, around 1000 AD, migrating from Alaska to Greenland, hunting whales with umiaks, igloos, kayaks, harpoons with toggling heads, adapting to eternal winter, eating raw meat for vitamins. The pain? Scurvy, frostbite, isolation. Yet they laugh in folklore, mocking the cold. Ironic resilience. As we approach 1492, native populations number 50 to 100 million across the Americas, diverse, sophisticated, enduring. From Inca roads spanning mountains to Aztec floating gardens, it's a tapestry of triumph and torment. But oh, the storm brewing across the Atlantic. Europeans with their germs, guns, and god complexes are about to turn this world upside down. Wait, that's teasing part 2, but let's linger on the pre-contact absurdities. In the plains before horses, spoiler, Spaniards bring those. Tribes like the Sioux hunt buffalo by driving herds off cliffs. Imagine the coordination, hundreds yelling, stamping, herding thousands of beasts to doom. Meat for months, but one slip and you're pancaked. Pain in the waist, not all carcasses used before rot sets in. In California, diverse tribes like Chumash with Tamils, plank canoes for ocean voyages, acorn mush as staple, ground in mortars, basketry so fine it's watertight, but fires ravage, earthquakes shake, survivals dance with nature's whims. The Northeast, Iroquois Confederacy forms around 1142 AD. Haudenosaunee, the Great League of Peace. 5 nations, later 6, uniting under a constitution that's oral but democratic. Women own land, choose chiefs. Ironic, more egalitarian than Europe, yet dismissed later as savages. Northwest Coast, Kwakiutl winter ceremonies. Masks transforming dancers into spirits. Wealth measured in coppers. Shield-like plates thrown into fires to show disdain for material. Absurd flexing in a resource-rich land. As we wrap this first chapter of Ancient Echoes, remember, these peoples weren't waiting for discovery. They were living, loving, fighting, innovating in a continent that was theirs. The pain of survival forged unbreakable spirits, laced with historical absurdities that make you chuckle through tears. Drop a comment. What's the most mind-blowing ancient adaptation you've heard? Did the Olmec's heads freak you out? But hold on, this is just the dawn. In part 2, Columbus crashes the party and the real nightmare begins. Stay tuned, survivors. Hey guys, the stage is set. Native Americans have spent millennia carving out empires, mastering nature, and laughing in the face of a continent that's half paradise, half death trap. But now, it's 1492, and a certain Italian sailor with a terrible sense of direction is about to crash land into their world. Spoiler alert, things get messy, fast. Welcome to part 2 of our epic, sarcastic, and gut-wrenching dive into the Native American saga, where survival meets betrayal, disease becomes a weapon, and the absurdity of history hits like a runaway buffalo. Picture this: Christopher Columbus, self-proclaimed genius navigator, sails west thinking he's hitting Asia, but stumbles into the Caribbean. October 12th, 1492, he lands on an island he calls San Salvador. The locals, likely Taino, call it home. He's greeted with curiosity, maybe some shiny shells, but Columbus? He's eyeing gold and glory. The irony? He thinks he's found the Indies, so he dubs the locals Indians, a name that sticks like a bad tattoo for centuries. Drop a comment if you've ever been mislabeled. How'd it feel? These folks had no clue their world was about to be turned upside down. The Taino offer hospitality, but Columbus sees opportunity. He journals about their generosity, then promptly enslaves some to dig for gold that barely exists. By 1500, the Taino population plummets from 250,000 to under 50,000. Why? Smallpox, measles, flu, diseases the natives have zero immunity against. Europeans carry these germs like grim reapers, and entire villages vanish faster than you can say quarantine. The pain, watching your children, elders, entire clans cough, burn, and die in weeks with no shaman or herb to stop it. The absurdity? Columbus gets statues, while the Taino get footnotes. By the 1510s, the Spanish are in full conquistador mode. Hernán Cortés lands in Mexico 1519 with 500 men, horses, and a hunger for gold. The Aztecs, ruling from Tenochtitlan, a floating city of 200,000 that makes Venice look like a backwater, are blindsided. Montezuma II, their emperor, thinks Cortés might be Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent god. Ironic, right? A god who brings smallpox and cannon fire. Cortés allies with rival tribes like the Tlaxcalans, who hate Aztec taxes as much as anyone hates IRS audits. By 1521, Tenochtitlan falls after a brutal siege. Starvation, disease, betrayal, the pain of an empire crumbling while priests pray to gods who don't answer. South America's next. Francisco Pizarro, a man with the charm of a rattlesnake, targets the Inca in 1532. Atahualpa, their emperor, rules a 2,500-mile empire with roads better than Rome's. Pizarro, with 180 men, ambushes him at Cajamarca. Atahualpa offers a room full of gold for freedom, delivers it, then gets garroted anyway. Classic European diplomacy. Smallpox had already softened the Inca, killing thousands before Pizarro's boots hit the ground. The absurdity, an empire of millions undone by a handful of bearded weirdos and their germs. The pain, survivors forced into mines, working until their bodies break. Back north, the 1500s see the Spanish poking around Florida in the southwest. Ponce de Leon hunts the fountain of youth, because eternal life is totally a thing, but gets an arrow in the thigh instead. By 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado treks through New Mexico, chasing rumors of golden cities. He finds Zuni pueblos, not El Dorado. The locals resist, he burns villages. The pattern's set: exploration, exploitation, extermination. Drop a comment. What's the dumbest thing you've chased, only to find it's a myth? By the 1600s, the English and French crash the party. Jamestown, 1607, is a swampy disaster. Starving colonists eat leather, then turn to cannibalism. True story. Powhatan, leader of the local confederacy, saves their sorry butts with food, only for the English to demand more land. Pocahontas? Yeah, she's real, but no Disney romance. Kidnapped, converted, paraded in England, dead by 21. The irony, she's a PR stunt for a colony that's basically a corporate scam. The pain, her people watch their forests cleared, their way of life eroded. Up in New England, the Pilgrims land at Plymouth, 1620, half dead from scurvy. The Wampanoag, led by Massasoit, teach them to plant corn and survive. Thanksgiving? Sure, but it's less kumbaya and more a tense diplomatic potluck. By 1637, the Pequot War erupts. English and their Narragansett allies torch a Pequot village, killing hundreds, mostly women and kids. Survivors are enslaved or scattered. The absurdity, civilizing a land by burning it to ash. The French, meanwhile, cozy up in Quebec, 1608, trading furs with the Huron and Algonquin. They're less about conquest, more about commerce. But don't get it twisted, they're still in it for profit. Their Jesuit priests try converting natives, preaching salvation, while smallpox does the real preaching. By the 1640s, the Iroquois, armed with Dutch guns, raid Huron villages in the Beaver Wars, fighting for fur trade dominance. The pain? Entire tribes displaced, cultures shredded over beaver pelts. The sarcasm, nothing says progress like fighting over rodent skins. By the 1700s, the eastern woodlands are a chessboard of European powers and native alliances. The Iroquois Confederacy, that democratic marvel, plays the French and English like a fiddle, balancing power to protect their lands. But the 7 Years' War, 1754 to 1763, screws them over. Britain wins, France is out, and natives lose their leverage. Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763, sees tribes like the Ottawa unite to push back British forts. They win battles but lose the war. The Proclamation of 1763 bans colonists from settling west of the Appalachians, a paper promise broken faster than you can say land grab. Out west, the Spanish mission system in California, starting 1769, is a masterclass in cultural erasure. Junipero Serra, saint to some, villain to others, builds missions to save natives like the Chumash. Forced labor, forced conversions, and, you guessed it, disease. By 1800, native populations in California drop by half. The irony, missions called guardians of souls destroy bodies and traditions. The pain, children torn from parents, whipped for speaking their language. The Plains tribes, like the Lakota and Cheyenne, get a brief glow-up in the 1700s thanks to horses, stolen or traded from Spanish herds. Suddenly, buffalo hunting is easier, mobility skyrockets, teepees get bigger, cultures flourish. But the sarcasm, horses make you badass, but they also make you a target. By the late 1700s, smallpox sweeps the plains, killing thousands. Survivors regroup, but the shadow of disease never leaves. Let's talk numbers. By 1800, Native American populations across the continent have crashed from maybe 50 million pre-contact to under 10 million. Smallpox is the MVP of this genocide, with assist from measles, flu, and warfare. Europeans don't need to swing swords when their microbes do the dirty work. The absurdity? Colonists call it providence, divine will clearing the land for them. The pain? Imagine your world shrinking, your stories silenced, your gods mocked. The 1800s dawn with the United States flexing its newborn muscles. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803, doubles its size, but its native land, Osage, Sioux, others. Lewis and Clark trek west 1804 to 1806, meeting tribes like the Mandan who host them through winter. The explorers call it diplomacy, the tribes call it survival. By 1811, Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader, tries uniting tribes against U.S. expansion. His dream dies at the Battle of Tippecanoe. The irony, Americans celebrate it as a victory for civilization, while a native unity fractures. The Southeast tribes, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, face a different beast, assimilation. By the 1820s, the Cherokee have a written language, thanks to Sequoia, plus schools, churches, even a newspaper. They're the model tribe, playing the white man's game. But Andrew Jackson, president and certified native hater, signs the Indian Removal Act 1830. The Trail of Tears begins, forced marches of thousands, 1831 to 1838. Cherokee lose a quarter of their people to disease, starvation, cold. The pain, walking 1,000 miles, watching your family die, knowing your home is stolen. The sarcasm, land of the free, unless you're native. Out west, the Navajo face similar horrors. The Long Walk, 1864, forces 8,000 from their Arizona homelands to a desolate New Mexico reservation. Hundreds die en route. The absurdity, U.S. Army calls it relocation for their own good. The pain, elders collapsing in the desert, children left behind. By the 1870s, the Plains Wars ignite. Gold in the Black Hills, sacred to the Willakota, brings prospectors. Treaties, like Fort Laramie, 1868, promise native land forever. Forever lasts about 6 years. The Great Sioux War, 1876, sees Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn. A Lakota Cheyenne victory led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. But the U.S. Army retaliates relentless. By 1881, most Lakota surrender, starving and outgunned. The irony, Custer's a hero in death, while a native resistance is called savagery. The Ghost Dance, a spiritual revival in the 1880s, promises a return to pre-contact days. Whites panic, fearing rebellion. December 29, 1890, Wounded Knee Massacre. 300 Lakota, mostly women and children, slaughtered by U.S. troops. The pain, bodies frozen in snow, a culture's hope gunned down. The sarcasm, America's new dawn built on graves. As we hit the 1900s, Native Americans are at their nadir, under 250,000 left. Reservations are prisons of poverty, disease, and despair. Boarding schools, like Carlisle, rip kids from families, cut their hair, ban their languages. Kill the Indian, save the man, they say. The absurdity, saving people by destroying them. Drop a comment. What's the most infuriating fix you've heard of? Yet, survival persists. Tribes like the Navajo, Cherokee, Lakota hold on to traditions in secret, passing stories under the radar. By 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act grants U.S. citizenship. Ironic, since they were here first. But voting rights? Spotty, thanks to state laws. The pain, being a citizen in name only, still marginalized. This chapter's a bloodbath, but it's not the end. Native resilience is a middle finger to history's cruelty. Part 3's coming, from boarding school scars to 20th century fights for rights. Drop a comment. What's the most shocking betrayal you've learned about? Stay tuned because the story's far from over. Hey guys, we've trudged through the cosmic punchline of Native American history. From thriving civilizations to the gut punch of European invasion, disease, and betrayal. By 1900, Native populations are a shadow of their former glory, down to 250,000, confined to reservations that feel more like exile than home. But don't cue the sad violin yet. Part 3 is where survival turns into defiance, where the absurdity of civilizing policies meets the unbreakable spirit of people who've been through hell and still spit in its face. This is the 20th century saga, a roller coaster of pain, resistance, and sarcastic resilience that'll make you cheer and wince. The 1900s kick off with Native Americans at rock bottom. Reservations are patches of land nobody else wanted. Think barren deserts or flood-prone plains. The U.S. government's big idea: assimilation on steroids. Enter the boarding schools like Carlisle Indian Industrial School, founded 1879 but peaking now. Native kids, some as young as 5, are torn from their families, shipped off to these institutions with a mission: kill the Indian, save the man. Hair cut, languages banned, traditional clothes swapped for stiff uniforms. Imagine being punished for speaking your mother tongue. Drop a comment if you've ever felt your identity erased. The pain, kids beaten, starved, or worse for resisting. The absurdity? This is sold as education to help them join a society that scorns them. By 1910, thousands of Native children endure this cultural meat grinder. Some die from disease. Tuberculosis rages in cramped dorms. Others run away only to face starvation or recapture. Survivors carry trauma, disconnected from their roots. Yet, in secret, elders on reservations keep traditions alive. Storytelling, dances, ceremonies hidden from prying eyes. The Navajo, for instance, preserve their sacred chants even as kids are taught to pray to a different god. The irony, a system hell-bent on erasure only sharpens Native resolve to remember. Meanwhile, land theft continues with a bureaucratic twist. The Dawes Act of 1887, still in effect, slices reservations into individual allotments, with surplus land sold to white settlers. By 1930, tribes lose 2/3 of their land, 90 million acres gone. The sarcasm: here's your plot, now be a farmer. In soil that barely grows weeds. Tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne, once lords of the plains, are reduced to scraps, dependent on meager government rations. The pain, hunger gnawing at communities, pride gutted as buffalo vanish and crops fail. But wait, there's a flicker of fight back. The Society of American Indians, formed 1911, is the first pan-tribal advocacy group, led by educated natives like Charles Eastman, a Santee Dakota doctor. They push for citizenship and rights. It's a bold move, but the irony? Many members are boarding school grads using the white man's tools: law, writing, speeches, to fight back. Progress is slow, the government barely listens. Still, it's a spark. Then comes 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act. Native Americans are finally U.S. citizens. Cue the confetti, right? Wrong. States like Arizona and New Mexico block voting with literacy tests or claim natives on reservations aren't residents. The pain: you're a citizen, but only on paper. The absurdity: the original inhabitants need permission to vote in their own homeland. Drop a comment. What's the most ridiculous hoop you've had to jump through for a right? The Great Depression, 1930s, hits reservations harder than most. No jobs, no food, no hope. And that's saying something when you're already at the bottom. But a new deal emerges, literally. John Collier, a reformer with actual empathy, becomes Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1933. His Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 is a game changer. Kinda. It halts allotment, encourages tribal self-government, and funds economic projects. Tribes like the Navajo and Cherokee draft constitutions, elect councils. Sounds great, but the sarcasm, self-government under the watchful eye of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who still hold the purse strings. The pain, rebuilding trust in a system that screwed you for centuries. World War II shakes things up. Over 25,000 Native Americans serve. Think Navajo code talkers, using their language to baffle Japanese code breakers. The irony? A language banned in schools saves American lives. Heroes like Ira Hayes, a Pima, raise the flag at Iwo Jima, but come home to racism and poverty. The pain, fighting for a country that doesn't fight for you. Post-war, some veterans use GI Bill benefits for education, but reservations remain economic black holes. The 1950s bring a fresh hell, termination policy. The U.S. decides tribes should integrate by dissolving their legal status. Over 100 tribes, like the Menominee and Klamath, lose federal recognition, land, and services. Reservations are sold off, communities scatter. The absurdity, be free, by losing everything that defines you. The pain, families uprooted, cultures frayed. By the 1960s, termination is a disaster. Even the government admits it, slowly reversing course. Enter the 1960s, and Native activism explodes. Inspired by the civil rights movement, young natives say, "Enough." The American Indian Movement, AIM, founded in 1968, takes a militant stance. Urban natives, displaced by relocation programs, rally in cities like Minneapolis. In 1969, the occupation of Alcatraz sees activists seize the abandoned prison for 19 months, demanding it become a cultural center. The sarcasm, claiming a rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay to make a point. The pain, media loves the stunt, but real change is glacial. The 1970s are a high watermark for resistance. In 1972, AIM's Trail of Broken Treaties march on Washington, D.C., occupies the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They demand treaty rights and self-determination. In 1973, Wounded Knee, South Dakota, site of the 1890 massacre, is occupied by AIM in Oglala, Lakota. It's a 71-day standoff with federal agents. 2 natives die, tensions skyrocket, but the world notices. The irony, fighting on sacred ground to reclaim rights stolen a century ago. Drop a comment. What's a cause you'd stand up for, no matter the cost? Legally, things shift. The Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 lets tribes control their own schools, health services, and programs. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 protects Native kids from being adopted out of tribes, a jab at decades of cultural theft via foster care. But the pain persists. Poverty rates on reservations hover at 40%, unemployment at 50%. The sarcasm, self-determination when your budget's a government handout. The 1980s see economic hustles. Tribes like the Mashantucket Pequot in Connecticut open bingo halls, then casinos after the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988. Foxwoods Casino becomes a cash cow, funding schools, clinics, cultural centers. The irony, using gambling, a vice in white eyes, to rebuild what was stolen. Not all tribes hit the jackpot. Many reservations stay dirt poor. The pain, wealth gaps between tribes spark tensions, while stereotypes of rich Indians fuel racism. By the 1990s, cultural revival gains steam. Native languages, once on life support, see classrooms teaching Navajo, Cherokee, Lakota. Powwows draw crowds, blending tradition with modern flair. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 forces museums to return sacred artifacts and remains. The sarcasm, thanks for giving back our ancestors' bones, guys. The pain, knowing so much was looted, lost forever. The 2000s bring legal battles and visibility. Cobell v. Salazar, a 1996 lawsuit, exposes the U.S. mismanaging billions in native trust funds. In 2010, a $3.4 billion settlement is won. A win, but pennies compared to what's owed. The pain, fighting for scraps of your own wealth. The absurdity, a government admitting it lost your money for a century. Politically, natives flex muscle. In 2008, Barack Obama's campaign engages tribes, promising inclusion. His 2010 signing of the Tribal Law and Order Act boosts reservation safety, tackling crime rates ignored for decades. But the sarcasm, needing a law to enforce laws on your land. Representation grows. Deb Haaland, Laguna Pueblo, becomes a congresswoman in 2018, later Secretary of the Interior in 2021. A historic first, but the pain. One voice in a sea of indifference. Environmental fights heat up. The Dakota Access Pipeline protests, 2016 to 2017, sees Standing Rock Sioux and allies camp against a pipeline threatening water and sacred sites. Brutalized by police, demonized by media, they still draw global support. The irony, protecting land while being called trespassers. The pain, tear gas, arrests, and a pipeline built anyway. By 2025, Native Americans number about 9 million, including mixed-race descendants. Urban natives thrive in cities, but reservations lag. 25% lack running water. Healthcare is a joke. Yet, culture booms. Native filmmakers, artists, and writers like Tommy Orange tell stories unfiltered. The sarcasm, Hollywood finally notices, but still casts non-natives in native roles. Drop a comment. What's a native story you want to see on screen? This chapter is a testament to grit. From boarding school nightmares to casino cash and protest camps, Native Americans turn survival into art. Part 4 is next, the modern era, where past pain fuels future power. What's the most inspiring comeback you've heard? Comment below, and let's keep this saga rolling. Hey guys, we've journeyed through the epic, absurd, and soul-crushing saga of Native American history, from Ice Age trailblazers to empires toppled by disease and greed, to the defiant resurgence of the 20th century. Now, we're in the home stretch, the modern era, from the 2000s to 2025. This is part 4, where Native Americans navigate a world that's still stacked against them, turning pain into power, loss into legacy, and historical absurdity into a sarcastic middle finger to oblivion. It's a story of resilience, reinvention, and a fight for justice that's as gripping as it is infuriating. Let's dive in. The early 2000s are a mixed bag. Native Americans, now numbering around 9 million, including mixed-race descendants, are split between urban hustlers and reservation dwellers. Cities like Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Minneapolis hum with native professionals, lawyers, artists, techies, building lives while keeping ties to their roots. But reservations? They're often stuck in a time warp of poverty. Picture this. 25% of homes on places like Pine Ridge lack running water in 2005. Healthcare is a cruel joke. Clinics underfunded, doctors scarce. The sarcasm, welcome to the land of opportunity, where your life expectancy on a reservation is a decade shorter than the national average. The pain, kids growing up with diabetes and despair, knowing the system's rigged. Yet, culture is a lifeline. Powwows explode in popularity, drawing thousands with drum circles, fried bread stands, and dancers in regalia that scream identity. Navajo, Lakota, Cherokee languages, nearly extinct in the 80s, see a renaissance. Schools on reservations teach Diné Bizad alongside algebra. The irony, languages once beaten out of kids are now on Duolingo. Drop a comment. What's a tradition you'd fight to keep alive? Native filmmakers like Sterling Harjo craft raw stories, while authors like Louise Erdrich win Pulitzers. The pain. Hollywood still loves casting non-natives in native roles, because apparently authenticity is optional. Economically, casinos remain a game changer for some. Tribes like the Seminole in Florida, who buy Hard Rock International in 2007, turned gaming into empires. Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun rake in billions, funding schools, museums, even language apps. But the sarcasm, not every tribe's rolling in it. Most reservations see no casino cash, stuck with unemployment rates hitting 50%. The stereotype of rich Indians fuels resentment, as if every native sipping margaritas by a slot machine. The pain, wealth gaps split tribes while outsiders sneer, ignoring centuries of stolen land. Legal battles keep the fire burning. The Cobell vs. Salazar settlement in 2010, $3.4 billion for mismanaged trust funds, sounds huge, but it's a drop in the bucket. The U.S. lost billions owed to natives for land leases since the 1800s. The absurdity, imagine your bank saying, "Oops, we misplaced your life savings," and handing you a fraction back. Tribes like the Blackfeet and Navajo push for more accountability, but bureaucracy moves like molasses. The pain. Justice delayed is justice denied, and elders die waiting. Politically, Native voices grow louder. In 2008, Barack Obama's campaign courts tribes, hosting summits and promising change. His Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010 boosts reservation safety, tackling crime rates the feds ignored forever. But the irony, needing a law to enforce laws on your own land. Deb Haaland's rise, Laguna Pueblo Congresswoman in 2018, then Secretary of the Interior in 2021, is a milestone. She's the first Native in a cabinet post, pushing land and water protections. The pain, one voice in a sea of indifference. Drop a comment. Who's a Native leader you admire? Environmental fights define the era. The Dakota Access Pipeline protests at Standing Rock, 2016 to 2017, become a global flashpoint. Sioux water protectors and allies camp in freezing North Dakota, facing militarized police, dogs, and water cannons to stop a pipeline threatening sacred sites in the Missouri River. The sarcasm, called trespassers on their own ancestral land. The pain, despite massive support, the pipelines built, oil flows, and sacred sites are disrupted. Yet Standing Rock sparks a movement, inspiring Native youth to demand climate justice. By 2025, pipeline battles continue, Line 3 in Minnesota, Enbridge in Wisconsin, with tribes like the Ojiv in Bad River leading the charge. Sovereignty's a constant tug-of-war. The McGirt vs. Oklahoma ruling in 2020 is huge. The Supreme Court affirms half of Oklahoma as reservation land for the Muskogee Nation, impacting 5 tribes. It restores treaty rights, but states and corporations push back, fearing lost control. The irony, Natives fighting for land promised in writing, while courts waffle. The pain, every legal win feels like a battle against history's weight. Cultural reclamation accelerates. By 2025, over 70 Native languages have revitalization programs. The Cherokee Nation's language department grows, training teachers in immersion schools. Lakota elders mentor kids in star knowledge, tying ancient astronomy to modern science. The sarcasm, cool, now the government funds what it tried to destroy. Museums return artifacts under NAGPRA, but the pain lingers. Countless sacred items remain in private hands, auctioned like trinkets. Technology becomes a tool. Native activists dominate platforms like X, amplifying issues from missing and murdered Indigenous women, MMIW, to boarding school reparations. The MMIW crisis, where Native women face violence at 10 times the national rate, gains traction by 2025 with federal task forces, but results are slow. The irony, a crisis ignored for decades gets hashtags, not solutions. Digital archives preserve oral histories while apps teach traditional songs. Drop a comment. What's a cause you've seen gain traction online? Health disparities haunt the present. COVID-19 hits reservations hard in 2020 to 2021, with Navajo Nation losing elders at horrific rates due to poor healthcare access. By 2025, telehealth programs help, but 30% of reservation homes lack broadband. The pain, dying from a virus while the world zooms on. The sarcasm, stay home advice when your home's a crowded trailer. Education evolves. Tribal colleges like Dene College and Haskell Indian Nations University grow, blending cultural knowledge with STEM. By 2025, they produce Native scientists tackling local issues, like Navajo engineers designing solar grids for off-grid homes. The irony, Natives solving problems the government ignored for generations. The pain, funding still a trickle, forcing students to hustle. Land-back movements gain steam. By 2025, initiatives return small parcels to tribes, like 18,000 acres to the Onondaga in 2023, but it's a fraction of what's owed. The sarcasm, here's a sliver of your stolen continent, you're welcome. The pain, sacred sites bulldozed for suburbs, with no apology. Yet tribes like the Chumash buy coastal lands back, inching toward restoration. As 2025 dawns, Native Americans are a paradox, vibrant yet wounded, thriving yet marginalized. Urban natives run businesses, while reservation life lags in infrastructure. Culture shines, powwows, films, books, but systemic inequity festers. The sarcasm, America loves Native art but not Native rights. The pain, fighting for visibility in a country built on your bones. This saga ends not with closure, but defiance. Native Americans weave past pain into future power, demanding land, justice, and a voice. What's next? Comment with your hopes for Native futures, or the wildest history fact you've learned. Thanks for writing this journey. Let's keep the fire burning. 1789. A year of exquisite fashion, delightful conversation, and the minor inconvenience of mass starvation. Welcome to the French Revolution, the ultimate historical reality show, where the price of bread is your head, and the only thing more revolutionary than the ideas is the body count. Stick around, because this is the story of how a nation went from let them eat cake to let's chop off everyone's head, and you thought your family dinners were dramatic. France in the late 18th century was, to put it mildly, a bit of a mess. It was a kingdom of staggering contrasts, a place where the aristocrats were so fabulously wealthy they could afford wigs that had their own weather systems, while the average person was so poor they considered dirt a viable food group. The country was ruled by King Louis XVI, a man whose primary interests included locksmithing and avoiding making any actual decisions. A hobbyist king, if you will. His wife, Marie Antoinette, the Austrian import with a penchant for extravagant hairdos and allegedly tone-deaf advice about cake, wasn't exactly helping the monarchy's public image. She was the living embodiment of out of touch, a walking, talking Fabergé egg in a country that couldn't afford actual eggs. Now, French society was neatly divided into 3 estates, which was a polite way of saying 3 wildly unequal groups of people who mostly hated each other. The first estate was the clergy, the folks who handled the god stuff. They owned about 10% of the land and paid basically 0 taxes, because apparently piety is its own form of currency. The second estate was the nobility, the descendants of medieval knights who had long since traded their swords for powdered wigs in a sense of entitlement so vast it could be seen from space. They also owned a huge chunk of the land and, you guessed it, paid almost no taxes. Their main job was to be noble, which mostly involved attending lavish parties and complaining about the quality of the champagne. And then there was the third estate. Oh, the glorious overworked and perpetually starving third estate. This group comprised, everyone else. From the well-to-do bourgeoisie, the lawyers, merchants, and doctors who had money but no titles, to the urban poor, the sans-culottes, literally those without fancy knee breeches, all the way down to the peasants who made up the vast majority of the population. The third estate accounted for about 97% of France, and they shouldered the entire tax burden. Imagine a pyramid scheme, but instead of losing your life savings, you lose your life. That was the Ancien Régime. It was less a functioning society and more a cruel joke, where the punchline was always more taxes. The situation was a ticking time bomb, and the timer was the French economy. A series of costly wars, including a little spat overseas called the American Revolution, you're welcome America, hope you enjoyed the bill, had left the royal coffers emptier than a philosopher's stomach. Add to that a few years of terrible harvests, and you have a recipe for disaster. The price of bread, the staple food for most French people, skyrocketed. People were spending 80% of their income just on a loaf of stale, gritty bread. It's hard to be a loyal subject when you're one missed meal away from becoming a skeleton. The air was thick with the scent of desperation and increasingly rage. In a desperate attempt to fix the unfixable, Louis XVI decided to do something truly radical for a French king. Ask for help. He summoned the Estates General, a sort of medieval parliament that hadn't met in 175 years. This was the political equivalent of finding a dinosaur in your backyard and asking it for financial advice. The idea was simple. Get the estates together and figure out a way to raise money, which really meant figure out a way to tax the nobles and clergy without them throwing a massive tantrum. Spoiler alert, they threw a massive tantrum. The Estates General convened at the Palace of Versailles in May 1789, and it was a disaster from the start. The Third Estate, finally given a voice, arrived with a long list of grievances, the Cahiers de Doléances. These were essentially the longest, most passive-aggressive complaint letters in history. Dear King, they read, we love you and all, but could we perhaps not starve to death? Also, the tax system is a festering wound on the body politic. Just a thought. The problem was the voting system. Traditionally, each estate got one vote. This meant the first and second estates, with their combined 3% of the population, could always outvote the third estate 2-1. It was the most rigged game in town, and the third estate was done playing, led by charismatic figures like the Abbé Sieyès, who famously asked, "What is the third estate?" Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it ask? To become something. The representatives of the common people decided to change the rules. On June 20th, 1789, they found themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall. In a moment of defiant improvisation, they decamped to a nearby indoor tennis court. Yes, the French Revolution was kicked off on a tennis court. History has a sense of humor. There, they swore the tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had written a new constitution for France. They declared themselves the National Assembly, effectively telling the king and the other two estates to go suck a lemon. Louis, in his infinite wisdom, responded with the decisiveness of a startled deer. He sort of agreed, then sort of didn't. He brought troops into Paris, which, as you can imagine, went over about as well as a fart in a crowded elevator. The people of Paris, already on edge from the bread shortages and the political drama, saw the soldiers and panicked. They needed weapons to defend themselves. And where do you find weapons in 18th century Paris? You storm the Bastille, of course. The Bastille was a medieval fortress-turned-prison, a hulking symbol of royal tyranny. In reality, it was mostly empty, holding only a handful of prisoners, including a few counterfeiters and one aristocrat, sent there by his own family for being a nuisance. But symbolism is a powerful thing. On July 14th, 1789, an angry mob descended on the fortress. The governor, the Marquis de Launay, tried to negotiate, but negotiations with 1,000 starving, angry Parisians are tricky. Shots were fired, chaos erupted, and after a bloody battle, the mob stormed the Bastille, brutally murdered de Launay, and stuck his head on a pike. They paraded it through the streets of Paris as a gruesome trophy. This was the new France. Liberty, equality, fraternity, and a severed head on a stick. The fall of the Bastille was a shockwave. It showed that the people were no longer afraid and that the king's authority was crumbling. Across the countryside, peasants, emboldened by the news from Paris, began to rise up in what became known as the Great Fear. They attacked the chateaux of their noble landlords, burning the feudal charters that had bound them to the land for centuries. It was a nationwide bonfire of the vanities, fueled by generations of resentment. The nobles, terrified, started fleeing the country in droves, becoming the émigrés who would plot their revenge from abroad. Back in Versailles, the National Assembly was working at a feverish pace, trying to build a new society from the ashes of the old. On the night of August 4th, in a fit of patriotic fervor, and probably a healthy dose of fear, nobles in the assembly stood up one by one and renounced their privileges. Feudalism, the ancient system of obligations and duties, was abolished in a single night. It was a stunning moment of unity, a brief, shining instant where it seemed like a peaceful revolution might just be possible. A few weeks later, they produced one of the most important documents in human history, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This declaration was a thunderclap of Enlightenment ideals. It proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It spoke of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It was a beautiful, soaring piece of rhetoric that laid the foundation for modern democracy. There was just one tiny, glaring omission: women. The "man" in the title was quite literal. The brilliant playwright and activist Olympe de Gouges would later write the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, for which she would be promptly ignored and later executed. The revolution, it turned out, had its limits. But while the politicians in their fancy halls were debating the nature of liberty, the women of Paris were still hungry. In October 1789, fueled by rumors that the royals were hoarding grain at Versailles, thousands of market women, armed with pitchforks, broomsticks, and a few cannons they'd picked up along the way, decided to take matters into their own hands. They marched the 12 miles from Paris to Versailles in the pouring rain, a fearsome, determined mob. They stormed the palace, demanding bread and the king's head, not necessarily in that order. They overwhelmed the royal guards, killed a few of them, and very nearly got their hands on Marie Antoinette, who famously had to flee her bedchambers in her nightgown through a secret passage. The Women's March on Versailles was a turning point. They didn't just get bread, they got the entire royal family. The mob forced Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children to leave the opulent isolation of Versailles and move to the Tuileries Palace in the heart of Paris. They were now, for all intents and purposes, prisoners of the revolution. The baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy, as the crowd chillingly called them, were now under the watchful eye of the Parisian people. The king was no longer the absolute monarch of France. He was a hostage to his own subjects. And so, as 1789 came to a close, France found itself in a strange and precarious position. The old world was dead, but the new one was still struggling to be born. The National Assembly was busy confiscating church lands to solve the ever-present debt crisis, printing a new paper currency called the assignat that would soon be worth less than the paper it was printed on, and trying to write a constitution that would somehow reconcile a king with a revolution. It was a time of immense hope and terrifying uncertainty, a period where anything seemed possible, from the creation of a utopian society to a complete descent into anarchy. The first act of this grand, bloody drama was over, but the stage was set for even greater chaos, for the rise of radicalism, the invention of the guillotine, and the chilling reign of a man who would come to be known as the Incorruptible. The revolution had only just begun to eat its children. What do you think was the biggest mistake the monarchy made that sealed their fate? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll dive deeper into the madness in part 2. The baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy were now residents of Paris, their gilded cage at Versailles swapped for a slightly less gilded, but infinitely more claustrophobic, cage at the Tuileries Palace. The year is 1790, and France is in the grip of a strange, feverish calm. The National Assembly, now calling itself the Constituent Assembly, was churning out reforms like a sausage factory. They redrew the map of France, creating the 83 départements that still exist today, a rational geometric grid imposed on a country of ancient, messy loyalties. They were building a new world on paper, convinced that reason and enlightenment could solve everything. Their biggest project? A constitution that would turn France into a constitutional monarchy, a system where the king would still get to wear the crown, but the assembly would hold the real power. It was a noble experiment in political engineering, like trying to build a functional spaceship out of spare parts from a horse-drawn carriage. But while the politicians were busy rearranging the deck chairs, they made a catastrophic misstep. In their quest to rationalize everything and pay off the kingdom's colossal debt, they turned their attention to the first estate, the church. In July 1790, they passed the civil constitution of the clergy. This wasn't just about seizing church lands anymore. This was a hostile takeover. The government declared that priests and bishops were to be elected by the people and paid by the state. They were to become, in essence, holy civil servants. And, most importantly, they had to swear an oath of allegiance to the new constitution, an oath that put the nation before the Pope in Rome. This was a spectacular own goal. For centuries, the local priest had been a pillar of the community, especially in the devout countryside. Now, the revolutionaries in Paris were telling them their loyalty to God was secondary to their loyalty to a piece of paper written by a bunch of lawyers. The clergy was split down the middle. About half of them, the juring priests, took the oath. The other half, the non-juring priests, refused, becoming outlaws in the eyes of the state, but heroes to their congregations. This single act did more to create a powerful, internal counter-revolutionary movement than anything the fleeing nobles could have dreamed of. It turned a political revolution into a religious war, dividing neighbor from neighbor and family from family. The assembly had wanted to control the nation's soul. Instead, they had just ripped it in two. Meanwhile, the political temperature in Paris was rising, thanks to the explosive growth of political clubs. These were the 18th century equivalent of podcasts. If your favorite podcasters were all screaming about liberty and occasionally calling for their opponents to be decapitated. The most famous of these was the Jacobin Club, a group of well-to-do, radical chic intellectuals who started as moderate constitutional monarchists, but were quickly drifting leftward. Their star was a small, impeccably dressed lawyer from Arras named Maximilien Robespierre. He was a man of intense, unwavering principle, a puritanical devotion to the revolution's ideals, and all the personal charm of a tax audit. He spoke endlessly about virtue and the public good, earning him the nickname the Incorruptible. For now, he was a relatively minor figure, but his quiet, chilling certainty was beginning to attract a following. If the Jacobins were the brains of the radical movement, the Cordeliers Club was its roaring, passionate heart. Based in a working-class district, they were rougher, louder, and far more extreme. Their leader was Georges Danton, a man who was everything Robespierre was not. He was a bull of a man, loud, charismatic, probably corrupt, but possessed of a powerful, earthy oratory that could move a crowd to tears or to bloodshed. And then there was Jean-Paul Marat, the golem of the revolution. A failed doctor and scientist, Marat was consumed by a paranoid rage against everyone in authority. He published a wildly popular newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, which he wrote while soaking in a medicinal bath to treat a debilitating skin condition. From his tub, he screamed for blood, publishing lists of traitors and demanding thousands upon thousands of heads. He was the revolution's dark, festering id, whispering poison into the public ear. While of this boy band of the apocalypse was tuning up, King Louis XVI was getting increasingly desperate. He had been forced to sign the civil constitution of the clergy, an act that, as a devout Catholic, he believed had damned his eternal soul. He saw the revolution spiraling out of his control, becoming more radical and anti-religious by the day. He was a prisoner in his own capital, forced to rubber stamp laws he despised. So, he decided to do what any sensible, cornered monarch would do, run for it. The plan, cooked up with the help of the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, who was probably, maybe, definitely in love with the Queen, was to flee Paris and make a dash for the eastern frontier. There, he would rally loyalist troops, and, with the help of his brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor, return to Paris at the head of an army and crush the revolution. It was a plan that depended on speed, secrecy, and a little bit of luck. It had none of those things. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family, disguised as the servants of a Russian baroness, slipped out of the Tuileries Palace. Their escape was a masterclass in incompetence. They insisted on traveling together in a massive, custom-built, and incredibly slow coach, because apparently, even when fleeing for your life, you need legroom. They were hours behind schedule, missed their military escorts, and generally made themselves as conspicuous as possible. The whole farcical enterprise came to a halt in the small town of Varennes. There, a local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, who had served in the army and seen the king before, recognized the face on his assignat banknote. He looked at the coin, looked at the pudgy man in the carriage pretending to be a valet, and thought, wait a minute. He galloped ahead, blocked the bridge out of town with a cart full of furniture, and the great royal escape was over. The capture of the king at Varennes was a psychological earthquake. It was undeniable, irrefutable proof that the king was not a reluctant partner in the revolution. He was its sworn enemy. He had tried to abandon his people and link up with foreign armies. The last shreds of respect for the monarchy evaporated. When the royal family was escorted back to Paris, the crowds that lined the streets were silent, their hats kept firmly on their heads in a gesture of profound contempt. The idea of a constitutional monarchy was now a joke. How can you have a kingdom when the king is a traitor? The calls for a republic, once a fringe idea, now became a roar. The radicals, led by the Cordeliers, organized a massive petition on the Champ de Mars, the field where a year earlier the nation had celebrated its unity to demand the king's abdication. On July 17, 1791, a huge crowd gathered to sign. The moderate-controlled assembly, desperate to maintain order and salvage their precious constitution, panicked. They declared martial law and sent in the National Guard, commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette, the hero of the American Revolution. The guards opened fire on the unarmed crowd. Dozens were killed. The Champ de Mars massacre was a horrific turning point. The revolution was now firing on its own people. The blood that soaked the altar of the fatherland was not the blood of aristocrats, but of poor Parisians. The fragile unity of the Third Estate was shattered. There were now two revolutions, the one of the bourgeois lawyers in the assembly, and the one of the sans-culottes in the streets, and they were increasingly at war with each other. The failed flight to Varennes also sent shockwaves across Europe. The crowned heads of the continent, who had been watching the events in France with a mixture of amusement and alarm, were now genuinely terrified. If the mighty King of France could be overthrown by his own subjects, who was next? In August 1791, the Emperor of Austria and the King of Prussia issued the Declaration of Pillnitz. It was a vaguely worded threat stating they would restore the French monarchy if the other European powers joined in. It was meant to intimidate the revolutionaries, but it had the opposite effect. It was seen as a declaration of war by proxy, proof that the crowned heads of Europe were conspiring with the émigrés to destroy the revolution. Inside France, a new faction, the Girondins, came to dominate the new legislative assembly. They were eloquent, idealistic, and dangerously reckless. They believed that the revolution could only be secured by exporting it. They began to agitate for a preemptive war, arguing it would expose the king's treachery once and for all, and unite the nation against a common enemy. It was a spectacularly bad idea, but one that appealed to almost everyone for the wrong reasons. The Girondins wanted war to spread the revolution. The Royalists wanted war because they thought France would lose, and the king would be restored. Robespierre was one of the few voices of sanity, arguing that the real enemies were inside France, not outside, and that war would lead to dictatorship. He was, as usual, ignored. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria. The War of Peoples against Kings began, and it began disastrously. The French army, disorganized and demoralized, suffered a series of humiliating defeats. Panic and paranoia swept through Paris. The enemy was at the gates, and it was all the fault of traitors at home. The king, the queen, the priests, the nobles, they were all in on it. Then came the final nail in the coffin of the monarchy. In late July, the commander of the combined Austrian and Prussian armies, the Duke of Brunswick, issued a manifesto. It promised that if the French royal family was harmed, the Allies would inflict an exemplary and forever memorable vengeance and subject Paris to military execution and total destruction. This was, without a doubt, the single greatest PR blunder in military history. The Brunswick Manifesto was meant to terrify the Parisians into submission. Instead, it united them in a white-hot fury. It was the ultimate proof that Louis was in league with the enemy. On August 10, 1792, the people of Paris, led by the Sans-Culottes and the radical National Guardsmen, rose up. They stormed the Tuileries Palace. The king's Swiss guards fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed and massacred. The king and his family fled to the Legislative Assembly, seeking protection. But there was no protection to be had. The Assembly, terrified of the mob, voted to suspend the monarchy and place the king under arrest. The royal family was imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval fortress in the heart of the city. The constitutional monarchy was dead. The revolution of 1789 was over. A new, far more radical and violent revolution was about to begin. France was now a republic in all but name, born in blood and fury. The stage was set for the trial of a king, the birth of the guillotine, and a descent into a period of state-sponsored terror that would make the world tremble. Was the Brunswick Manifesto the stupidest threat in history, or was the monarchy doomed long before that? Drop your theories in the comments. The bloodletting is about to get organized. The fall of the monarchy on August 10th didn't so much solve France's problems as it created a whole new, much scarier set of them. The Legislative Assembly was technically in charge, but everyone knew the real power now resided with the Paris Commune, the radical city government run by the likes of Danton, Robespierre, and their friends. It was a city humming with paranoia. The Prussian army was advancing, promising to burn Paris to the ground. The prisons were overflowing with suspected traitors, aristocrats, royalists, and priests who had refused to swear that silly oath to the Constitution. The air was thick with rumors that these prisoners were planning to break out, slaughter the good patriots of Paris, and welcome the Prussians with open arms. It was a conspiracy theorist's paradise. In the first week of September 1792, this paranoia curdled into psychosis. Spurred on by the bloodthirsty shrieks of Marat's newspaper and the thunderous, ambiguous speeches of Danton, who was now Minister of Justice, the people of Paris decided to take preventative measures. For 5 gruesome days, mobs of sans-culottes stormed the city's prisons. They dragged the prisoners out, held them before impromptu people's tribunals that were little more than kangaroo courts, and then hacked them to pieces in the courtyards. Priests, nobles, Swiss guards, petty criminals, prostitutes, street urchins, it didn't matter. If you were in a prison, you were guilty. Over 1,200 people were butchered in what became known as the September Massacres. It was a dress rehearsal for the terror, a spontaneous explosion of popular fury. justified by its architects as a regrettable but necessary act of self-defense. They were purifying the nation, one throat at a time. And then, just as the blood was being washed from the cobblestones of Paris, a miracle occurred. On September 20th, at a dreary, rain-soaked place called Valmy, the Revolutionary Army, a ragtag collection of veterans and passionate, untrained volunteers, stood its ground against the invincible Prussian war machine. There was no grand cavalry charge, no heroic last stand. It was an artillery duel. The French cannon, superior in number and skill, pounded the Prussian lines. The Prussians, suffering from a severe case of dysentery and shocked that the French didn't just run away, decided they'd had enough of France, its revolutionary fervor, and its terrible food. They packed up and went home. Valmy was a minor skirmish that became one of the most decisive battles in history. It saved the revolution, proving that an army of free citizens could defeat the hired guns of kings. The great German poet Goethe, who was there, supposedly remarked, "From this day and from this place, a new era in the history of the world has begun." The very next day, September the 21st, 1792, the newly elected National Convention met for the first time. Its deputies were younger, more radical, and far less interested in compromise than their predecessors. Their very first act was to abolish the monarchy. After 1,000 years, the French king was no more. France was officially a republic. They even started a new calendar, declaring this moment the beginning of year 1 of liberty. Out with saints and kings, in with reason and harvest cycles. It was the ultimate rebranding exercise. But the convention was immediately paralyzed by factionalism. On one side were the Girondins, the eloquent orators from the provinces who had pushed for war, but were now horrified by the September massacres and the lawless power of the Paris mob. On the other side sat the Montagnards, the hardcore radicals from the Paris clubs, Robespierre, Danton, Marat, who embraced the mob and saw violence as the engine of the revolution. In the middle sat the majority of deputies, known as the Plain, or more contemptuously, the Marche. They were the swing voters, the timid, indecisive mass that would ultimately side with whoever seemed most likely to win. The first and most pressing item on the agenda was a question that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. What do you do with a dethroned king? He was no longer Louis XVI, King of France and Navarre. He was now simply Citizen Louis Capet, a portly middle-aged man locked in a tower with his family. The Girondins dithered. A trial, yes, but what then? Imprisonment? Exile? They feared his execution would ignite a war with all of Europe and make him a martyr. The Mountain had no such qualms. For them, it was simple. As Robespierre argued in one of his cold, terrifyingly logical speeches, the king was a traitor, a rebel against the people's sovereignty. His very existence was a threat to the Republic. Louis must die, he declared, so that the nation may live. The discovery of the Armoire de Fer, a secret iron chest in the Tuileries Palace containing Louis's private correspondence with Austria and the émigrés, sealed his fate. The evidence was damning. The trial began in December. Louis defended himself with a quiet dignity that surprised many, but it was useless. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The convention voted one by one out loud for the whole city to hear. He was found guilty, of course. The real drama was the vote on his punishment. It was agonizingly close, but by a narrow majority, the sentence was death. On January 21st, 1793, Louis Capet was driven through the silent, heavily guarded streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution. The guillotine, the new, rational, and terrifyingly efficient killing machine, was waiting. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin hadn't invented it, but he had promoted it as a humanitarian alternative to clumsy beheadings and hangings. It was the revolution's gift to modern execution. Liberty, equality, and a swift, clean decapitation for all. Louis tried to give a final speech, to declare his innocence and forgive his enemies. But the commander of the National Guard, Antoine Joseph Santerre, a brewer by trade, ordered a drum roll to drown him out. A moment later, the blade fell. The executioner held up the severed head, and a great cry of "Vive la République" erupted from the crowd. They had killed a king. It was the ultimate act of defiance, the point of no return. They had burned the bridge to the past, and now the only way was forward, through the fire. The execution of the king sent a thunderclap across Europe and through France itself. England, Spain, and Holland joined Austria and Prussia in the war against the Republic. France was now an international pariah, surrounded by enemies. Internally, the country exploded. In the fiercely Catholic and royalist region of the Vendée in western France, the king's execution, combined with a new decree for a nationwide military draft, was the final straw. Peasants who had cared little for the political squabbles in Paris but cared deeply for their king and their church rose up in a massive, furious rebellion. They formed a Catholic and royal army and waged a brutal guerrilla war against the Satanic Republic. This wasn't a debate over constitutions anymore. It was a savage civil war, a fight for the very soul of France. With foreign armies invading, a massive civil war raging, the economy in freefall, and people starving in the streets of Paris, someone had to be blamed, and that someone was the Girondins. They were seen as weak, indecisive federalists who were protecting traitors and failing to prosecute the war effectively. The sans-culottes, whipped into a frenzy by Marat and other radical journalists, demanded their heads. In the spring of 1793, the convention, now dominated by the Mountain, created the tools that would define the next year of French history. The Revolutionary Tribunal, a court with no appeal, designed to try traitors quickly, and the Committee of Public Safety, a 12-man executive body given sweeping powers to defend the Republic from its enemies, both internal and external. The final showdown came on June 2nd. 80,000 armed sans-culottes and National Guardsmen surrounded the convention hall, pointing cannons at the doors. They demanded the arrest of 29 leading Girondin deputies. Inside, the deputies debated and postured, but they were prisoners. Terrified, they caved. The Girondins were arrested, stripped of their power, and placed under house arrest. The Mountain and the Paris mob had won. The revolution had eaten its first leaders. The purge of the Girondins only deepened the crisis. Across France, in cities like Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux, the provinces rose up in the federalist revolts against the tyranny of Paris. The country was tearing itself apart, and it was in this atmosphere of simmering civil war that a young woman from Normandy named Charlotte Corday decided to take history into her own hands. A supporter of the Girondins, she believed that one man was responsible for all the chaos, all the bloodshed, all the hatred poisoning France: Jean-Paul Marat. She traveled to Paris, bought a large kitchen knife, and on July 13, 1793, she talked her way into his apartment. She found him where he spent most of his days, soaking in his medicinal bath, or writing his next list of traitors to be killed. She told him she had names of Girondin plotters from her hometown. As he reached for a pen, she plunged the knife into his chest. Charlotte Corday thought that by killing the monster, she could bring peace. She could not have been more wrong. Marat, the golem in the bathtub, was instantly transformed into a holy martyr of the revolution. His death didn't end the violence. It unleashed a hurricane of vengeance. The demand for blood, for a terrible, swift, and organized response to the Republic's enemies, became an irresistible roar. The Federalist revolts, the war in the Vendée, the foreign armies at the gates, and now the assassination of a revolutionary saint. It was all too much. The convention, pushed by the Jacobins and the sans-culottes, declared that it was time to get serious. It was time to make terror the order of the day. The Committee of Public Safety, with Maximilien Robespierre now its guiding voice, was given almost dictatorial power. The machinery was in place. The law of suspects was passed, allowing the arrest of anyone who seemed less than enthusiastic about the revolution. The guillotine was sharpened. The reign of terror was about to begin in earnest. Was this bloody turn inevitable, a necessary evil to save the Republic from collapse, or was it the moment the revolution betrayed its own ideals? Let me know your verdict in the comments. The incorruptible are about to become the executioners. Welcome to the main event, the part of the story where the revolution stops pretending it's about rights and debates and fully embraces its true passion: industrial-scale murder. The reign of terror has arrived. The year is 1793, and France is run by 12 men in a small room, the Committee of Public Safety. And at the center of that committee sits Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, a man who loves humanity so much he's willing to kill half of it to make the other half virtuous. His logic was simple. To build a perfect republic of virtue, you first had to get rid of all the people who weren't virtuous. And his definition of virtuous was, shall we say, narrow. The instrument of this purification was the guillotine. the national razor. It became the star of a daily gruesome show in the public squares of Paris. The law of suspects passed in September 1793 made being arrested easier than catching a cold. Were you a noble? Suspect. A priest? Suspect. Did you complain about the price of bread? Suspect. Did you not seem cheerful enough about the latest batch of executions? Definitely suspect. The Revolutionary Tribunal was a legal conveyor belt. The trials were swift, the verdicts were preordained, and the only appeal was to a higher power you probably no longer believed in. The first major celebrity to face the razor was the former queen, the widow Capet, Marie Antoinette. Her trial was a sham, full of wild accusations, including the disgusting and baseless claim of incest with her young son. She faced it all with a stoic, icy dignity that had eluded her in life. On October 16th, she was carted through the streets, her hair shorn, her hands bound, not in a private carriage like her husband, but in an open cart, exposed to the jeers of the crowd. She was followed shortly after by the Girondin deputies who had been arrested back in June. They went to the scaffold singing the Marseillaise, revolutionaries devoured by the revolution they helped create. But the terror wasn't just about killing political opponents. It was about forcibly remaking society from the ground up. The committee launched a fanatical de-Christianization campaign. They saw the Catholic Church as a source of superstition and counter-revolution. So they went to war with God. Churches were closed, their bells melted down for cannons. Religious icons were smashed, priests were forced to marry. They even created a new rational calendar with 10-day weeks, so long Sunday, and months named after the weather: Brumaire, fog; Thermidor, heat; Fructidor, fruit. They held a grotesque festival of reason in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, where they dressed up an actress as the goddess of reason and paraded her around the desecrated altar. It was the revolution at its most absurd, a group of angry men trying to cancel 2,000 years of history. And yet, amid this madness, the terror worked, on the military front at least. Lazare Carnot, the organizer of victory on the Committee of Public Safety, instituted the levée en masse, a total mobilization of the country for war. Every man, woman, and child had a role. The young men shall go to battle. The married men shall forge arms and transport provisions. The women shall make tents and clothes and serve in the hospitals. The children shall turn old linen into lint. The old men shall betake themselves to the public squares in order to arouse the courage of the warriors and preach hatred of kings and the unity of the republic. It was terrifyingly effective. The ragtag army of Valmy was transformed into a disciplined, patriotic fighting machine of over 1 million men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. They pushed back the invaders on all fronts and began to conquer new territory. The Republic was saved, baptized in blood, but as the external threats receded, the terror turned inward, devouring itself in a cannibalistic frenzy. By the spring of 1794, Robespierre saw enemies everywhere. To his left were the ultra-radicals, the Hébertists, who controlled the Paris Commune and wanted even more blood, more atheism, more chaos. They were a threat to the committee's centralized control. So, Robespierre, the master of virtue, accused them of being foreign agents and moral degenerates. In March, Hébert and his followers were rounded up and sent to the guillotine. The mob they had so often incited barely shed a tear. Next, Robespierre turned to his right. There stood Georges Danton and his followers, the Indulgents. Danton, the charismatic firebrand who had rallied France against the invaders, was now tired of the killing. He argued that the terror had served its purpose and it was time for clemency, for a return to normality. For Robespierre, this was a cardinal sin. To stop the terror before true virtue had been achieved was to betray the revolution. Clemency was just another word for treason. Despite his immense popularity, Danton was arrested along with his brilliant, witty friend Camille Desmoulins, whose writings had once sparked the storming of the Bastille. Danton's trial was a piece of political theater. He defended himself with such thunderous force that the committee had to rush through a decree to silence him. His last words on the scaffold were for the executioner: "Don't forget to show my head to the people. It's well worth seeing." With Danton's death in April 1794, Robespierre stood alone. He was the undisputed master of France, the Pope of the Revolution. He had eliminated all his rivals. He was at the peak of his power, and he was completely doomed. Having purged both the left and the right, Robespierre accelerated the slaughter. He passed the law of 22nd Prairial, which ushered in the Great Terror. The new law stripped away the last vestiges of a fair trial. No witnesses, no defense lawyers. The court could only deliver one of two verdicts, acquittal or death. The guillotines of Paris went into overdrive, killing over 1,000 people a month. It was a paranoid bloodbath. People were executed for mispronouncing a name, for serving sour wine, for not being enthusiastic enough. At the height of this madness, Robespierre made his most catastrophic error in judgment. He tried to replace the atheistic cult of reason with his own pet religion, the cult of the Supreme Being. It was deism with Robespierre as its high priest. On June 8, 1794, he orchestrated a massive bizarre festival in Paris. Dressed in a sky-blue coat, holding a bouquet of flowers and wheat, he led a procession and gave a long, rambling sermon about God and morality. His colleagues on the Committee of Public Safety watched him horrified. They saw not a statesman, but a would-be dictator, a new pontiff. They started to wonder if their own names were on his next list. The end came swiftly. On July 26th, 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, Robespierre went to the convention and gave his final speech. It was a rambling 3-hour tirade, full of self-pity and menace. He spoke of a conspiracy against public liberty, and claimed there were traitors in the committees and even in the convention itself, but crucially, he refused to name them. This was a fatal mistake. Now, everyone felt the cold breath of the guillotine on their neck. Fear, the very emotion Robespierre had wielded so expertly, now united his enemies. The next day, when he tried to speak, he was shouted down. Cries of "Down with the tyrant" filled the hall. The convention, the same body that had trembled before him for a year, summoned its courage and voted for his arrest. He and his closest followers were taken, then freed by the Paris Commune, and they holed up in the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. But the Parisian mob, the sans-culottes, did not rise to save him. They were exhausted by the terror and angry about a new wage freeze the committee had imposed. The convention declared Robespierre an outlaw, and its troops stormed the building. In the chaos, Robespierre was shot in the jaw, shattering it and silencing the voice that had sent so many to their deaths. The next day, July 28, 1794, Robespierre, his jaw crudely bandaged, was guillotined without a trial, under the very laws he had championed. The executioner ripped off the bandage just before the blade fell, eliciting a final agonized scream. The crowd roared with joy. The reign of terror was over. What followed was the Thermidorian reaction. The revolution took a hard right turn. The surviving deputies, deeply traumatized, dismantled the machinery of the terror. Jacobin clubs were closed and a white terror was unleashed on the former terrorists. The new leaders were the survivors, the cynics, the profiteers. The intense, austere virtue of Robespierre was replaced by lavish parties, extravagant fashion, and open corruption. France was exhausted. It had been through 10 years of revolutionary fever and just wanted to take a nap. This led to a new government in 1795, the Directory. It was a 5-man committee, designed to be weak and avoid another dictatorship. It was corrupt, inefficient, and constantly lurching from crisis to crisis, beset by royalist uprisings on the right and Jacobin plots on the left. The one institution that gained strength and prestige during this period was the army, which was still winning glorious victories abroad, and the most successful general of that army was a young, ambitious Corsican named Napoleon Bonaparte. He had made a name for himself defending the convention from a royalist mob in 1795 with a whiff of grape shot. While the politicians in Paris bickered, Napoleon was winning battles in Italy and Egypt, becoming a national hero. In 1799, he saw his chance. The Directory was on the verge of collapse. He returned to France, and on November 9th, the 18th of Brumaire, he, along with some co-conspirators, overthrew the government in a clumsy but effective coup d'etat. The French Revolution was over. It began in 1789 with a demand for liberty and the end of absolute monarchy. It ended 10 years later with a military coup that would soon lead to an emperor. They had traded King Louis XVI for Emperor Napoleon. So, here's the final question for you. Was the whole decade a tragic failure that ended right back where it started? Or was it a necessary, bloody, and chaotic journey that, despite its horrors, permanently changed the course of human history? Let me know your final verdict on this glorious, terrifying mess in the comments below. You think you know the British Empire? Stiff upper lip, cups of tea, ruling a quarter of the world with calm, methodical precision. Well, forget all that. The story of the British Empire isn't a chess game played by geniuses. It's a 400-year-long bar fight started by accident, managed by idiots, and powered by greed, desperation, and truly, truly terrible weather. This is the story of how a damp, irrelevant island on the edge of nowhere stumbled, bullied, and lucked its way into becoming the biggest empire the world has ever seen. It's a tale of glorious intentions and catastrophic results. Welcome to the nightmare of history. Our story begins in the late 1500s. England is the European equivalent of that weird cousin you don't invite to parties. It's cold, it's wet, the food is boiled into a gray mush, and everyone is vaguely dying of the plague. The real global superstars are Spain and Portugal. They've got the tans, the cool ships, and they found a cheat code for reality called South America, which they are diligently looting for every last piece of gold and silver. Back in London, Queen Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen, is watching all this with ferocious envy. She can't afford a proper war with Spain, the global superpower. So she does the next best thing. She legalizes piracy. She didn't call it piracy, of course. That would be uncivilized. She called it privateering. This basically involved giving a fancy piece of paper to salty sea dogs like Francis Drake that said, "Dear sir, please feel free to steal absolutely everything from any Spanish ship you can find. P.S. I get a cut." Drake, a man who was basically a walking nautical crime spree, took to this with enthusiasm. He sails around the world, not for discovery, but to find new and exciting ways to mug the Spanish. He raids towns, plunders treasure ships, and generally makes a nuisance of himself. He comes back to England with so much stolen Spanish treasure that it pays off the entire national debt and funds the government for a year. Elizabeth knights him for it. Imagine the Queen today knighting a guy who just successfully hacked and emptied the accounts of every bank in China. That's the level of glorious state-sponsored gangsterism we're talking about. This, understandably, annoyed Spain. King Philip II, a man whose chin was as Habsburg as his Catholicism was intense, finally had enough. He builds the largest fleet in history, the Spanish Armada, to sail to England, crush the heretic queen, and put a stop to all this nonsense. 1588, the Great Showdown. English history paints this as a heroic victory of plucky little England against a giant. The reality? The English ships were smaller and more maneuverable, yes, but they were also desperately short on gunpowder. At one point, they were literally firing their last cannons and preparing for the worst. What saved them? The weather. A massive storm, which the English proudly called the Protestant wind, swept in and smashed the mighty armada against the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The English didn't win, they just got incredibly biblically lucky. But it was enough. It created a national myth. It gave them the idea, the dangerous, intoxicating idea, that maybe God was on their side and maybe, just maybe, this whole ocean thing was for them. And so, the fumbling attempts at empire began. First up, in 1583, a gentleman adventurer named Sir Humphrey Gilbert sails to Newfoundland. It's cold, it's rocky, it's full of fish. He sticks a flag in the ground, claims it all for England, and officially starts the British Empire. A truly glorious moment. On the way home, his tiny ship is caught in a storm. As his vessel began to sink into the freezing Atlantic, he was reportedly last seen sitting on the deck, reading a book, and shouting to the crew of the other ship, "We are as near to heaven by sea as by land," before promptly drowning. The British Empire was born, and its founder was dead within months, a fitting start. Attempt number 2, Roanoke, 1587. Let's try a warmer place. 100 or so settlers are dropped off on an island off the coast of North Carolina. The governor, John White, sails back to England to get more supplies, but gets stuck there for 3 years because of the whole Armada business. When he finally returns, the colony is gone. All of it. The houses are gone, the people are gone. The only clue is a single word carved into a post, Croaton. No bodies, no signs of a struggle. They just vanished. Were they killed? Did they join a local tribe? Did they get abducted by aliens who couldn't stand the thought of English cooking spreading across the continent? We still don't know. The first English child born in America, Virginia Dare, disappeared along with them. The empire is now 2 for 2 on catastrophic failures. Third time's the charm, right? 1607, Jamestown, Virginia. This one is going to be permanent, they said. It'll be a paradise, they said. The Virginia Company, a joint stock company basically invented to monetize America, sends a group of men. The problem is who they sent. They weren't farmers or builders. They were gentlemen. And a 17th century gentleman's primary skill was complaining and avoiding manual labor. They landed in a malarial swamp, surrounded by dense forest, and proceeded to do what they did best, absolutely nothing useful. They spent their days digging for gold, which didn't exist, instead of planting crops. The local Powhatan Confederacy, led by the formidable Chief Powhatan, watched these helpless, starving idiots and probably wondered if this was some kind of elaborate practical joke. The first few years were a living hell. It's called the starving time. And it is not an exaggeration. Out of 500 colonists, only 60 survived one winter. They ate their horses, then their dogs, then their cats and rats, then the leather from their shoes and belts, and then, finally, each other. Yes, the first permanent English settlement in America was founded on cannibalism. Forensic evidence has confirmed it. They dug up the body of a 14-year-old girl, butchered for her meat. This wasn't a noble enterprise, it was a season of a horror survival show. The only reason the colony survived at all was due to 2 things. 1, the dictatorial leadership of Captain John Smith, a tough-as-nails mercenary who basically said, "He that will not work shall not eat." And 2, tobacco. They didn't find gold, but they found something better. A highly addictive plant that Europe went crazy for. Smoking was the new craze, and Virginia had the perfect soil for it. Suddenly, the colony had a purpose. Not to build a new society, but to get filthy rich growing a drug. This set the template for many future colonies. Find a single cash crop and exploit it for all it's worth, no matter the human cost. And that cost was high. Tobacco farming is labor-intensive. At first, they used indentured servants, poor English people who signed contracts trading 5 to 7 years of their life as property in exchange for passage to America. It was a brutal system, but those servants were white. And when they finished their term, they wanted land. This created a problem for the wealthy planners. Their solution would change the course of history. In 1619, a Dutch ship sold them the first African captives. The economics were simple and monstrous. An indentured servant worked for a few years. An enslaved African worked for life. Their children worked for life. And so, the nightmare of chattel slavery began to weave itself into the very fabric of the American dream. While the cannibals were figuring out tobacco in Virginia, another group of English weirdos was heading for America for entirely different reasons. We call them the Pilgrims. They weren't seeking freedom of religion in the way we think of it. They were religious separatists, extremists who believed the Church of England was still too Catholic and flashy. They were so rigid and pious they made everyone else uncomfortable. First they went to Holland, but found the Dutch too tolerant and liberal for their tastes. So, they decided to go to America. In 1620, they boarded the Mayflower, aiming for Virginia. They were terrible sailors. They missed Virginia by hundreds of miles and ended up landing at a place they named Plymouth in modern-day Massachusetts. They had no legal right to be there, no charter, no permission. So, while still on the boat, they wrote a document called the Mayflower Compact. It's hailed as a foundational text of American democracy. It was actually a panic-written document that basically said, "Look, we're all stuck here together. Let's agree not to murder each other until we figure out what the hell we're doing." Their first winter was, predictably, a disaster. They landed in December. They were unprepared. They had the wrong supplies. Half of them died from starvation, scurvy, and the cold. They survived only because the local Wampanoag tribe, who had already been devastated by European diseases, decided to help them, teaching them how to plant corn and where to fish. The famous First Thanksgiving was a real event, but it was less a moment of brotherly love and more a temporary alliance of mutual convenience that the English settlers would later betray. These New England colonies grew, populated by Puritans who wanted to build a city upon a hill, a perfect religious society. Perfect as long as you believed exactly what they did. They were famously intolerant, hanging Quakers and banishing anyone who disagreed with them. So we have two models of English colony now, the get-rich-quick death camp in the south and the holier-than-thou religious state in the north. But let's be honest, the real money, the real engine of the early empire, wasn't in North America at all. It was in the Caribbean, the West Indies, islands like Barbados and Jamaica. This is where the empire dropped its civilized mask and revealed its terrifying greedy heart. The business here was sugar, and sugar was white gold. Europeans had an insatiable sweet tooth for their tea, their cakes, their rum, and the Caribbean was the perfect place to grow sugarcane. But it was, and is, one of the most brutal, deadly crops to cultivate. The work was back-breaking in scorching tropical heat. The process of boiling the cane juice was dangerous, with workers regularly falling into vats of boiling sugar. No free person would do this work, so they created hell on earth. At first, they used white indentured servants, many of them Irish or Scottish prisoners of war. They were worked to death. The phrase barbaded became a verb, meaning to be kidnapped and shipped to the islands for forced labor. But as the sugar plantations grew into massive, industrial-scale operations, the planters turned almost exclusively to enslaved Africans. Millions of people were kidnapped from their homes in Africa, packed into the stinking, death-filled holds of slave ships, and brought to these islands to be worked to death in the cane fields. The average life expectancy for an enslaved African on a sugar plantation was 7 years. 7 years. It was a system of calculated, industrial-scale human misery designed to produce a luxury commodity. The immense wealth of Bristol and London, the grand houses, the refined culture of 18th century Britain was built on the foundation of this suffering. This was the dark, demonic engine of the early empire. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, another English entity was taking its first baby steps. It wasn't a colony, it was a company. The most powerful and terrifying corporation in history, the East India Company. Chartered in 1600, its goal was simple: get a monopoly on the spice trade. Spices like pepper, cloves, and nutmeg were worth more than their weight in gold in Europe. The trade was dominated by the Portuguese and more fiercely the Dutch, so the English showed up in India and Southeast Asia, not as conquerors, but as nervous merchants. They had to beg and plead with the incredibly powerful Mughal emperors who ruled most of India for permission to build little trading posts, which they called factories. These weren't places of manufacturing, they were warehouses to store goods. The early English traders in places like Surat were a pathetic sight, sweating in their woolen clothes in the Indian heat, constantly getting sick from strange diseases, trying to navigate a political and cultural landscape that was infinitely more sophisticated than their own. They were businessmen, not empire builders. Their great rivals, the Dutch East India Company, were much more ruthless. In 1623, on the island of Ambon, the Dutch arrested, tortured, and executed 10 English merchants, accusing them of conspiracy. This event, the Amboina Massacre, effectively kicked the English out of the lucrative Spice Islands and forced them to focus on India instead. It was a blessing in disguise. They started trading in cotton textiles, calico, and silk from India, which would eventually become just as profitable as spices. But for now, the East India Company was just a corporation, with its own ships, its own employees, and a relentless desire for profit. It wasn't ruling anything, it was trading, but it was learning, and it was waiting. And just as things were getting interesting overseas, England decided it was the perfect time to have a complete and utter psychotic breakdown at home. The English Civil War. From 1642 to 1651, the country tore itself apart. It was Parliament versus the King, Roundheads versus Cavaliers. It was a fight about religion, about power, and about who had the right to tax everyone. It ended with something no one expected. They cut off their king's head. In 1649, King Charles I was executed, and England became a republic, a commonwealth, led by the stern, puritanical, and deeply unfun Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a military genius, but a terrible party guest. He banned Christmas, closed the theaters, and generally tried to outlaw any form of enjoyment. This chaos at home had huge consequences for the fledgling empire. Royalist refugees fled to Virginia and the Caribbean. Puritan refugees fled to New England. The colonies were left largely to their own devices. But Cromwell, being a military man, also had an imperial vision, albeit a brutish one. He believed in a strong, centralized, and aggressive foreign policy. He beefed up the navy, and in 1655, as part of his Western design to attack the Spanish Empire, his forces captured the island of Jamaica. It was a bit of a consolation prize. They'd failed to take the main target of Hispaniola, but it would become one of the most important and brutal slave colonies in the entire empire. The Civil War forged a more militant and assertive England. The idea of a state-driven, powerful empire was beginning to take shape from the bloody chaos of revolution. What do you think? Was it the greedy corporation or the religious fanatics who were worse? Let me know in the comments which brand of historical horror you find more fascinating. The stage was now set. A patchwork of chaotic, accidental, and brutal settlements was about to be forged into something far more formidable. The age of organized absurdity was about to begin. So, England has executed its king, banned fun, and accidentally acquired a few bits of land full of cannibals, religious zealots, and sugar. The empire is less a grand design and more a collection of disastrous holiday destinations. But then, in 1660, England gets bored of being miserable. They invite the executed king's son, Charles II, back to the throne. The Restoration. Theaters reopen, fancy wigs are in, and a general air of sleazy aristocratic fun returns, and with it, a new, more organized approach to getting rich and annoying the rest of the world. First on the agenda, tidying up America. Look at a map from the 1660s. You've got the puritanical grumps in New England up north. You've got the tobacco-addicted ex-cannibals down south in Virginia and Maryland, and right in the middle, like a stubborn Dutch wedge, is New Amsterdam. It's run by the Dutch West India Company, it's making a lot of money, and it's annoyingly foreign. This will not stand. In 1664, during one of the many naval squabbles with the Netherlands fought entirely over who gets to be the world's delivery driver, the English send a few ships to New Amsterdam. They sail into the harbor and say, "This is ours now." The Dutch governor, a peg-legged, famously grumpy man named Peter Stuyvesant, tears his hair out. He wants to fight. He tries to rally the citizens. But the citizens, a mix of Dutch, Germans, French, and Swedes, are mostly interested in selling beaver pelts and drinking in taverns. They'd take one look at the English guns, shrug, and say, "Fine, whatever." The colony is handed over without a single shot fired. King Charles gives it to his brother, the Duke of York, and that's how New Amsterdam became New York. The British Empire conquered the future financial capital of the world with the equivalent of a strongly worded letter. With the map looking neater, the king starts handing out more of America, like party favors to his friends. To a group of 8 loyal aristocrats, he gives a huge chunk of land south of Virginia. They call it Carolina. Their inspiration for running it? The sugar hellscape of Barbados. They imported the Bajan model of giant plantations and brutal race-based chattel slavery. But instead of sugar, the cash crops here were rice and indigo. This required 2 things: vast amounts of backbreaking labor in snake-infested malarial swamps and expertise in how to actually grow rice. The English had no idea, but people from West Africa did. So, the planters specifically demanded enslaved people from the rice-growing regions of Africa, stealing not just their bodies but their agricultural knowledge to create a system that would crush them. As a little side of historical irony, the constitution for this new colony was co-written by the famous philosopher John Locke, the man who wrote that all men have a right to life, liberty, and property. His constitution for Carolina, however, gave masters absolute power and authority over their enslaved people. Liberty for me, but not for thee, a classic of the genre. Then came Pennsylvania, the weirdest of them all. It was a gift, or rather a debt payment, to a man named William Penn. Penn was a Quaker, and Quakers in 17th century England were considered dangerous weirdos. They were pacifists, they refused to swear oaths, and they insisted on treating everyone, even kings, as equals. For this, they were persecuted, jailed, and beaten. The king owed Penn's late father a fortune, so he gave young William a massive piece of America just to get rid of him. Penn saw his chance to build a utopia, a holy experiment. He called it Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods. He advertised a policy of total religious freedom, and most shockingly of all, fair dealings with the native people. He actually learned the local Lenape language and paid them for their land. It was revolutionary, it was decent, it was humane, and, of course, it couldn't last. The promise of cheap land and no persecution attracted floods of immigrants, Germans, Scots, Irish, who did not share Penn's pacifist, tolerant views. They pushed west, they clashed with the natives, and Penn's holy experiment slowly curdled into the same story of expansion and conflict as everywhere else. But for a brief, shining moment, one part of the British Empire was founded on peace and respect. It's the exception that proves the rule. Just as the colonies were getting established, England decided it was time for another political meltdown. King Charles II dies and his brother, the Duke of York, becomes King James II. Problem: James is Catholic, enthusiastically Catholic. He starts putting Catholics in high positions, which for staunchly Protestant England is like putting a fox in charge of the henhouse. So, in 1688, the English political elite do something remarkable. They stage a coup and invite a foreign army to invade their own country. They write to the Dutch king, William of Orange, who happens to be married to James's Protestant daughter Mary, and say, "Hey, fancy a new kingdom?" William, who needs England's help in his endless war against France's super king Louis XIV, says, yes. He lands in England with an army. James II panics and flees, and William and Mary are crowned joint monarchs. This is called the Glorious Revolution, because in England almost no one died. It was a smooth, tidy political transition that established the supremacy of Parliament over the king once and for all. It wasn't so glorious in Ireland and Scotland. In Ireland, the Catholic majority backed James. William took his army there, and at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, he crushed them. This victory cemented Protestant domination of Ireland for centuries, leading to brutal anti-Catholic laws, land confiscations, and a legacy of bitterness that echoes to this day. One man's glorious revolution is another man's brutal conquest. This is the fundamental equation of empire. The revolution also locked Britain into a state of permanent war with France. For the next 125 years, Britain and France would be locked in a global struggle for dominance, a kind of proto-world war fought in the fields of Europe, the forests of America, and on the plains of India. And how do you pay for these endless wars? With money. And where does the money come from? A lot of it comes from the single most profitable and most monstrous enterprise of the 18th century, the Atlantic slave trade. The empire was now a master of this horrific business. They perfected what was known as the triangular trade. It was a conveyor belt of human misery. Step 1. British ships loaded with guns, textiles, and manufactured goods sail to the coast of West Africa. Step 2. These goods are traded for human beings, men, women, and children, captured by other Africans or kidnapped by the slave traders themselves. Step 3. The ships, now packed with human cargo, sail the Middle Passage to the Americas. This was a vision of hell. People were crammed into spaces so tight they couldn't stand, chained together in filth and darkness for weeks on end. Disease, suicide, and murder were rampant. A significant percentage of the captives died on every voyage. Those who survived were sold at auction in the Caribbean or the American colonies, stripped of their names, their families, their humanity, and forced into brutal labor. Step 4. The ships, now empty of people, were filled with the products of their labor, sugar, rum, molasses, tobacco, cotton, and sailed back to Britain to be sold for a huge profit, which was then reinvested in more ships and more guns to start. The triangle all over again. This wasn't some shady back alley business. This was the foundation of the British economy. The port cities of Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow grew into metropolises on the profits of slavery. The British government chartered the Royal African Company, giving it a monopoly on the trade. When that monopoly was broken, independent merchants rushed in. British ships would eventually carry more than 3 million enslaved Africans to the Americas, more than any other nation. The wealth generated funded the Royal Navy, which protected the trade routes. It financed the country estates and the London banks. It was the fuel and the engine of the 18th century British war machine. While philosophers in Edinburgh and London were talking about the Age of Enlightenment and the rights of man, their society was being bankrolled by the most profound denial of those rights imaginable. While this engine of misery was roaring in the Atlantic, the other great British enterprise, the East India Company, was transforming. The Mughal Empire, which had for so long kept the Europeans confined to their coastal trading posts, was beginning to crumble. Following the death of the powerful Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707, the empire fractured into competing successor states and principalities, all vying for power. For the company, this chaos was a ladder. The traders in their factories in Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta started to think differently. It was no longer enough to just trade. They needed to protect their investments in this newly volatile landscape, so the company did something unprecedented for a private corporation. It started building its own army. They hired local Indian soldiers, called sepoys, and drilled them in European-style warfare, led by a small cadre of British officers. At first, this army was purely defensive, but then the French showed up. The French East India Company had the same idea, and since Britain and France were always at war in Europe, their companies started fighting each other in India. They fought proxy wars, backing rival Indian princes, lending them their company troops and artillery in exchange for money and trading privileges. And in this arena, a sociopathic, ambitious, and brilliant company clerk named Robert Clive discovered he had a genius for violence and betrayal. The company was no longer just a group of merchants. It was becoming a state within a state, a militarized corporation that could wage war, sign treaties, and acquire territory. And to top off this era of consolidation, Britain itself consolidated. In 1707, the Act of Union was passed, officially joining the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland into a single entity, Great Britain. It wasn't exactly a love match. Scotland was financially ruined after a spectacularly failed attempt to start its own empire with a colony in Darien, Panama, which had been wiped out by disease and Spanish opposition. They were broke. England, meanwhile, was worried that a poor, independent Scotland might side with France in their endless wars. So, a deal was struck. Scotland got access to England's trading empire, and England got to secure its northern border and eliminate a potential enemy. With the Union came the Scottish Enlightenment, and more importantly for the empire, it brought a flood of ambitious, educated, and tough Scots into the system. Scottish soldiers, doctors, engineers, and administrators would become some of the most enthusiastic and effective agents of British imperialism around the globe. So, by the early 1740s, the picture is complete. The haphazard project of the 17th century has become the well-oiled machine of the 18th. We have a united Great Britain, a global commercial system powered by slavery and sugar, a string of increasingly populous and wealthy colonies in America, and a private company in India that is slowly, quietly, transforming into a predator. The stage is set for a global showdown. The 7 Years' War is coming, a conflict that will be fought on every continent and every ocean. It will be the first true world war, and it will decide who gets to be the world's #1 superpower. The British are feeling confident. They have the ships, they have the money, they have the manpower. What could possibly go wrong? Well, ask yourself this: what happens when you teach your children about liberty while also being a tyrannical parent? Let me know in the comments how you think that particular family argument is going to end. Alright, let's get back to it. Our story left off with Great Britain feeling pretty good about itself. It's got a brand new union, a navy swimming in slave money, and a corporation in India that's learning how to fight. France is the arch rival, the final boss of the 18th century. What the world needed, clearly, was a 7-year-long, planet-spanning brawl to settle the score. And that's exactly what it got. The 7 Years' War, or as the Americans, in their typical self-centered fashion, called it the French and Indian War. This wasn't just a war, it was the first true world war. It was fought in the snowy forests of Canada, on the sun-baked plains of India, in the sugar islands of the Caribbean, on the high seas of the Atlantic, and in the muddy fields of Europe. It was a global cage match for imperial supremacy. In America, it started off badly for the British. They sent over swaggering redcoat armies who were brilliant at marching in straight lines on an open field, but utterly useless in the dense, terrifying wilderness of North America. General Braddock's expedition to capture Fort Duquesne was a masterclass in colonial disaster. He marched his men, complete with a brass band, through a forest, where they were promptly ambushed by a much smaller force of French and Native American fighters. It was a slaughter. The British learned a hard lesson. The New World didn't play by Old World rules, but they adapted. They started cooperating more with their colonial militias. The same militias that were learning valuable military skills they would later use in a slightly different context. The tide turned when the British war effort was taken over by William Pitt the Elder, a man who believed with manic conviction that France had to be crushed no matter the cost. He threw money at the war like it was going out of fashion, funding armies in Prussia to keep the French busy in Europe, while the Royal Navy strangled French trade and ferried troops across the globe. The climax came in 1759, the Annus Mirabilis, or Year of Miracles. In 1 year, the British won decisive victories everywhere. The most iconic was the Battle of Quebec. Both the British general, Wolfe, and the French general, Montcalm, died in the short, brutal fight on the Plains of Abraham, a suitably tragic and dramatic end to French dreams of a North American empire. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, the East India Company was having its own Year of Miracles 2 years earlier. In 1757, Robert Clive, the moody clerk turned commander, faced the army of the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The Nawab had recently captured the company's base at Calcutta. In the process, a number of British prisoners had died overnight in the fort's dungeon, an incident that was immediately spun by British propaganda into the legendary Black Hole of Calcutta, a story of Oriental cruelty that justified anything they did next. Clive marched to face the Nawab at a place called Plassey. On paper, Clive was doomed. He had 3,000 men. The Nawab had 50,000. This should have been an annihilation, but this wasn't a battle. It was a business transaction. Clive, the ultimate corporate raider, had secretly bought off one of the Nawab's key commanders, Mir Jafar, promising to make him the new Nawab if he'd just have his soldiers stand around and do nothing during the fight. So, the battle commenced. It started to rain. The Nawab's army, being incompetent, didn't cover their gunpowder. The British, being professionals, did. When the rain stopped, Clive's muskets went bang and the Nawab's went fizz. Mir Jafar's section of the army refused to fight. The rest of the army panicked and the whole thing turned into a rout. The company won with fewer than 100 casualties. For this act of colossal bribery and betrayal, Clive was hailed as a military hero, a conqueror. He installed his puppet, Mir Jafar, on the throne, and then proceeded to systematically asset strip Bengal, the richest province in India. The company forced the new puppet Nawab to grant them the right to collect taxes, the Diwani. A private corporation was now the effective government of a state with 20 million people. This wasn't trade. This was looting on an industrial scale. The wealth of an ancient civilization began to be funneled into the pockets of company shareholders in London. By 1763, the war was over. The Treaty of Paris was a staggering victory for Britain. They got Canada from France. They got Florida from Spain. France's presence in India was reduced to a few irrelevant trading posts. Great Britain was now the undisputed global superpower. Britannia really did rule the waves. They had a vast, wealthy empire, a peerless navy, and a smug sense of their own invincibility. It was the greatest moment in the nation's history, and it was the exact moment it all started to go wrong. Winning a world war is ruinously expensive. Britain was broke. The national debt had doubled. The government in London, led by King George III and his ministers, looked across the Atlantic at their American colonies. The colonies were prosperous. They had been protected by the Royal Navy. The war had been fought in large part to secure their safety from the French and their native allies. So, the British government had a thought that seemed perfectly reasonable to them. The Americans should help pay for it. They started with the Sugar Act. Then, in 1765, the big one, the Stamp Act. It was a tax on all paper goods, newspapers, legal documents, playing cards. It was a small tax, but it was the first direct tax Parliament had ever tried to levy on the colonies, and the colonists went absolutely ballistic. Their rallying cry was, "No taxation without representation." They had no members in the British Parliament, so Parliament had no right to take their money. The British response was basically, "Don't be silly, you are virtually represented. We in Parliament represent the interests of the entire empire. You ungrateful children." This went down about as well as you'd expect. There were riots, tax collectors were tarred and feathered, and the colonies boycotted British goods. They were so effective that London was forced to repeal the act. It was a humiliation for the crown and a massive victory for the colonists. They had learned that organized resistance worked. The British government, like a frustrated parent, couldn't let it go. They kept trying to find clever ways to assert their authority and raise money. The Townshend Acts taxed things like glass, lead, paint, and most famously, tea. The colonists responded with more boycotts. Tensions simmered and then boiled over in 1770 on the streets of Boston. A mob of angry Bostonians was harassing a squad of British soldiers. They threw snowballs, rocks, and insults. The soldiers, panicked and surrounded, opened fire, killing 5 civilians. It was a chaotic, ugly street brawl that got out of hand, but in the hands of colonial propagandists like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams, it became the Boston Massacre, a brutal slaughter of innocents by bloodthirsty tyrants. The empire was now firing on its own people. The final straw was tea. The British government, in a move to bail out the struggling East India Company, passed the Tea Act. This wasn't a new tax, it actually made tea cheaper for the colonists. But it gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America, cutting out colonial merchants. For the colonists, this was the ultimate symbol of corrupt, distant power controlling their lives for the benefit of a mega-corporation. So in December 1773, a group of protesters, disguised as Native Americans in a move of questionable taste, boarded 3 company ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. It was an immense act of property destruction, the modern equivalent of sinking several container ships. The British government was furious. They had had enough. They passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They shut down the port of Boston, suspended the government of Massachusetts, and sent in the army. This was no longer about money, it was about control. Britain was trying to crush the rebellion. Instead, they united the colonies against them. In 1775, at Lexington and Concord, colonial militia clashed with British troops sent to seize an arms cache. Someone fired a shot, no one knows who, and the American War of Independence began. The war was a disaster for Britain. On paper, they should have won easily. They had the largest, best-trained professional army in the world and the most powerful navy. They were fighting a ragtag collection of farmers and shopkeepers with no real government, but the Americans had a home field advantage. They were fighting for their own homes. And their commander, George Washington, was a genius at one thing: not losing. He knew he couldn't beat the British in a straight fight, so he just kept his army alive, fighting a guerrilla war, retreating, surviving, and wearing the British down. The sight of red-coated soldiers marching in perfect formation into a New Jersey forest to be picked off by rebels hiding behind trees is the perfect metaphor for the whole war. It was the world's greatest power getting a wedgie from its own children. The ultimate humiliation came in 1778. France, still seething from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw its chance for revenge. They signed an alliance with the United States. Suddenly, Britain was fighting its rebellious colonies and its old arch-enemy. The war went global again. By 1781, a British army under Lord Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown, Virginia, caught between Washington's army on land and the French navy blocking his escape by sea. He surrendered. The war was effectively over. Britain, the victor of the great global war for empire, had lost to its own creation. The loss of America was a stunning, traumatic blow. It was the end of the First British Empire. Pundits in Europe predicted that Britain was finished as a great power, but they were wrong. The empire wasn't a single, coherent thing. It was a sprawling, multi-headed beast, and losing one head just made the other stronger. The focus shifted. With America gone, India became the absolute prize. The looting, now streamlined under a government body called the Board of Control, continued with renewed vigor, and the search began for new territories, new opportunities. The voyages of Captain James Cook in the 1770s had mapped vast, previously unknown lands in the Pacific, most notably a giant weird continent called Australia. With the American colonies no longer available as a dumping ground for Britain's overflowing prisons, they had a brilliant idea. In 1788, the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay. They were establishing a new colony for a new purpose, a penal colony, a continental prison on the far side of the earth. Britain had lost a colony of freedom-loving farmers and replaced it with a jail for pickpockets and petty thieves. The Second British Empire, the one we think of today, the Empire of India, Africa, and Australia, was rising from the ashes of the first. It would be an empire of conquest, not settlement, an empire of governors and generals, not pilgrims. It would be bigger, grander, and in many ways even more brutal. Having lost its first family, what kind of relationship would Britain forge with its new subjects? Tell me, do you think empires can learn from their mistakes, or are they doomed to repeat them on an even grander scale? Let me know your thoughts down below. So, Britain has lost its favorite child, America, and been publicly humiliated at the family reunion. The party's over, right? Wrong. For the British Empire, losing America was like a washed-up rock band firing its lead singer. It was a crisis, for sure, but it was also a chance to reinvent the brand. Welcome to the Second British Empire. Bigger, meaner, and this time fueled by steam, sanctimony, and the single-minded pursuit of total global domination. The first order of business was dealing with the French again, specifically one short, ambitious Corsican with a serious chip on his shoulder, Napoleon Bonaparte. The Napoleonic Wars were the final, world-shattering sequel to the century-long duel with France. Napoleon conquered Europe with breathtaking speed, but he had one problem: the English Channel, and floating on it, the Royal Navy. The showdown came in 1805 at Trafalgar. Admiral Horatio Nelson, a man who had already lost one eye and one arm in previous fights, devised a brilliantly insane plan to sail his fleet directly into the enemy line, breaking it in two. It worked. The combined French and Spanish fleets were annihilated. Nelson was killed by a sniper in the process, becoming Britain's greatest national martyr. With the seas secured, Britain could sit on its island fortress, funding and supplying anyone who would fight Napoleon on land, while its navy went around the world like a school bully stealing lunch money, picking up French, Spanish, and Dutch colonies from South Africa to the Caribbean. The war finally ended in 1815 at Waterloo. Britain stumbled out of the 25-year-long conflict victorious, bankrupt, and now, without a single serious rival anywhere on the planet, the Age of Britain had begun. This was the Victorian era, the imperial century, and it ran on a new, terrifyingly powerful fuel: the Industrial Revolution. Britain wasn't just a nation of shopkeepers anymore. It was the workshop of the world. Factories in Manchester and Birmingham belched smoke and churned out textiles, iron, and machinery at a rate never before seen in human history. This industrial beast was insatiably hungry. It needed two things: cheap raw materials to feed it, and captive markets to sell its finished products to. And what better source for both than a global empire? The empire became a vast, interconnected economic machine. Cotton was grown by peasants in India and Egypt, shipped to Lancashire, spun into cloth by factory workers living in squalor, and then shipped back to India to be sold, destroying the local textile industry in the process. It was a perfect, profitable, and monstrously exploitative loop. But this new empire wasn't just about money. It had a new ideology. The Victorians, in their infinite, top-hatted self-assurance, believed they weren't just conquering people, they were civilizing them. This was the era of the white man's burden, the deeply racist and arrogant belief that it was the solemn duty of the British to rule over lesser peoples for their own good. They would bring them Christianity, commerce, and railways. They genuinely saw themselves as the heroes of the story, striding into the darkness with the light of progress, while simultaneously pocketing all the diamonds. This combination of immense greed and unshakable self-righteousness is what made the Victorian Empire so uniquely, terrifyingly effective. Nowhere was this more true than in India, the jewel in the crown. After Plassey, the East India Company had spent a century bleeding India dry. But in 1857, the whole rotten system exploded. The spark was a rumor among the sepoys, the Indian soldiers in the company's army. The new Enfield rifles they were issued used cartridges greased with animal fat, and to load the rifle you had to bite the cartridge open. The rumor was that the fat was a mixture of pork lard and beef tallow. For Muslim soldiers, pork is forbidden. For Hindu soldiers, the cow is sacred. It was a single act of catastrophic cultural ignorance. It confirmed every suspicion that the British were trying to destroy their religions and their way of life. Mutiny erupted. It spread across northern India with furious speed. It was not just a mutiny. It was a brutal, desperate war for independence, marked by horrific massacres on both sides. The British suppression of the rebellion was even more brutal. Entire villages were razed. Rebels were strapped to the mouths of cannons and literally blown to pieces. When the dust settled, the East India Company was abolished. The British government took direct control. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India. The British Raj began. It was a system of absolute power, run by a few thousand British civil servants who administered hundreds of millions of Indians. They built railways, telegraph lines, and vast irrigation schemes, all designed to better control the country and extract its wealth. They also brought bureaucracy, bizarre social customs, and a level of condescension so profound it could be measured by geologists. With India secured, the Victorians turned their attention to the last great prize, a continent they knew almost nothing about, Africa. For centuries, Europeans had only nibbled at its edges. Now, armed with steamships that could travel up rivers and quinine to survive malaria, they plunged in. The result was the scramble for Africa, one of the most absurd and tragic episodes in history. From roughly 1880 to 1914, the European powers went on a frenzied, competitive land grab. The whole sordid affair was formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884. Here, a group of white men in suits sat around a table in Germany and carved up an entire continent with rulers and pencils, drawing straight lines across maps that ignored every existing ethnic, linguistic, and political reality. They created the borders of modern Africa without a single African in the room. Men like Cecil Rhodes, a mining magnate and arch-imperialist, became heroes. He dreamed of a British Africa stretching from Cape to Cairo, and once said he would annex the planets if he could. This wasn't colonization, it was a smash-and-grab raid on a continental scale, justified by the usual flimsy excuses about civilization and Christianity. The empire was at its absolute zenith, a quarter of the world's land mass, a fifth of its population. The sun, as they proudly boasted, literally never set on it. From the arid plains of Australia to the dense jungles of Malaya, from the frozen wastes of Canada to the tiny but strategic rock of Gibraltar, it was all painted red on the map. It was an empire of staggering diversity, held together by the telegraph cable, the steamship, and the Maxim gun. But at the very moment of its greatest glory, it was already rotting from within. In South Africa, the British fought a grim, difficult war against the Boers, white farmers of Dutch descent. It was a conflict where the British introduced the world to the concentration camp, herding Boer women and children into camps where tens of thousands died of disease and neglect. The war was eventually won, but it was a brutal, ugly affair that tarnished Britain's image. Then came the great act of European suicide, World War I. In 1914, the great powers, tangled in a web of alliances and imperial rivalries, blundered into the most catastrophic war in history. The empire rallied. Over 2.5 million men from the colonies and dominions, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Africans, volunteered or were conscripted to fight for a king they had never seen and a country most had never visited. They died in the mud of Flanders and the sands of Mesopotamia. Britain and its empire were victorious, but the cost was unimaginable. The country was financially crippled, an entire generation was traumatized, and the very nature of the empire had been called into question. If they were fighting for the freedom of small nations in Europe, why not in India or Ireland? The fall, when it came, was shockingly fast. The Second World War delivered the final fatal blow. Britain stood alone against Hitler in 1940, its finest hour, but by 1945, it was exhausted and utterly broke. It could no longer afford its empire. The true power in the world was now the United States, which had little interest in propping up Britain's colonial system. The signal that the game was truly over came from the jewel in the crown. In India, a small, frail lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi had forged a new weapon: non-violent civil disobedience. He organized marches, boycotts, and protests that made the empire look both brutal and ridiculous. In 1947, a war-weary Britain finally gave up. India was granted independence, but the British parting gift was poison. In their haste to leave, they drew a line on a map, partitioning the subcontinent into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The result was a firestorm of sectarian violence. Millions were uprooted, and up to 2 million people were slaughtered in one of the worst bloodbaths of the 20th century. A fittingly catastrophic end to the Raj. India's independence started a domino effect. The wind of change, as Prime Minister Harold Macmillan called it, blew across the globe. One by one, the colonies fell away. Some peacefully, like Ghana. Some through brutal colonial wars, like the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. Britain's final attempt to act like a global power without American permission, the Suez Crisis of 1956, ended in total humiliation. Over the next 2 decades, the red on the map vanished, replaced by a constellation of newly independent nations. The empire was dismantled, leaving behind a complicated legacy of parliamentary democracy, the English language, the rules of cricket, and a host of unresolved conflicts, economic dependencies, and deep-seated resentments. The final symbolic curtain fell at midnight on June 30th, 1997. In a rain-swept ceremony, the last major British colony, Hong Kong, seized in the Opium Wars to sell drugs to China, was handed back. The Union Jack was lowered for the last time. After 414 years, the great, terrifying, magnificent, and absurd project was over. It had begun with a failed expedition and a drowned knight and ended with a televised ceremony and a handshake. It had encompassed everything from state-sponsored piracy to industrial slavery, from cannibalism in Jamestown to concentration camps in South Africa, from the heights of Victorian self-confidence to the depths of post-war exhaustion. It had built cities, exploited continents, and changed the face of the planet forever. Was it a force for progress or a machine of exploitation? A civilizing mission or a 400-year-long crime spree? Or was it just a chaotic, accidental, and darkly hilarious nightmare of history? The accounts are still being settled. What's your final verdict on this grand, terrible story? Let me know in the comments below. Imagine a city so stubborn it refuses to be merely Rome, so flamboyantly Eastern that its mosaics glare like tiny suns, and so bureaucratically efficient that death itself fills out forms. Welcome to Byzantium. Stay for 12 centuries of political theater, holy wars, plagues, and palace intrigue that reads like someone mixed a theological debate with a courtroom drama and forgot to stop. If you like cruelty dressed up as ceremony, you're home. And hey, before we get blood on the marble, tell me in the comments, which scandalous Byzantine ruler would you like to gossip about first? In 330 AD, Constantine the Great planted a flag on a damp, mosquito-ridden peninsula called Byzantium and told everyone this was now the capital. He called it New Rome because slightly closer to the Silk Road sounded less glamorous in official proclamations. Constantine's city was half parade ground and half miracle. Basilicas rose, Christian bishops rehearsed sentences that would echo for millennia, and the imperial palace turned its balconies into vantage points for policy announcements and assassination practice. The empire itself split its attention like an aging juggler between Europe and Asia, and between trying not to collapse and looking fabulously imperial while doing it. The early centuries of Byzantine life were ruled by an odd marriage, Roman law and Greek culture. Imagine a bureaucrat who quotes Homer while stamping your tax receipt. Laws and lists proliferated. Emperors were the stars of the show, but emperorship in Byzantium came with fine print. Your reign lasted as long as the palace guard's mood and the theological fad of the week didn't turn against you. There were other hazards too. Promoters of correct Christianity had the habit of writing dissenters out of history and occasionally out of life. Theology was not an academic hobby. It was practical politics with smiting included. Enter Justinian I, part visionary, part litigator, part man with an unusually large building budget. He wanted to be remembered, so he did 3 things simultaneously. He rewrote Roman law, which made lawyers ecstatic and peasants slightly less so, launched military campaigns to reclaim lost western provinces, and commissioned a church so sparkling that even the heavens felt. Judge Hagia Sophia rose under his orders, a dome the size of an argument, and when it was finished, Justinian supposedly proclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." Whether Solomon heard the insult is a historical question. Whether the dome outdid, contemporary engineering is not. Justinian's reconquests were impressive on paper. Parts of North Africa, Italy, and southern Spain flickered back into imperial color. In practice, these victories were expensive and exhausting. The administrations he reabsorbed were hardly keen on paying taxes twice. The Italian campaign, led by generals such as Belisarius, showcased tactical brilliance, stubborn sieges, and the Byzantine knack for turning battlefield success into administrative headaches. The result, territories that were technically reconquered but practically full of resentful locals and fiscal deficits. Despite this, the prestige gain was enormous. For a while, people could look at an old Roman ruin and say, "We own that again." which, in pre-social media terms, was the ancient world's version of a power flex. Then came the plague, the Justinianic plague of the 540s, possibly the first wave of bubonic devastation to sweep Eurasia, arrived like an unpaid invoice for empire building. Cities emptied, tax coffers shrank, and the army's ranks were thinned. One day, you have a full complement of soldiers and administrators. The next, your tax collector has been replaced by a neighbor who does a reasonable impression of a tax collector. The plague reshaped economies and allowed new actors, local elites, bishops, and opportunistic warlords to take on roles formerly monopolized by imperial bureaucracy. Byzantium survived, but it was like a marathon runner who'd fallen into a bramble and continued the race with a limp. Religious disputes, meanwhile, became national sport. Debates over the nature of Christ, the use of icons, and the boundaries of orthodoxy were not confined to cloistered monasteries. They echoed through markets, echoed louder in courts, and provoked riots that would have made any modern protest organizer blush. Icons, paintings, and mosaics of Christ, the Virgin, and saints functioned both as windows to the divine and as tinder for political conflagrations. One faction thought icons were blasphemous, another thought they were necessary aids to devotion. Emperors sometimes chose sides because they genuinely believed, and sometimes because their choice would win them another tax season. This conflict, called iconoclasm, would tear through the empire twice in the coming centuries like a particularly judgmental typhoon. Meanwhile, the eastern frontier simmered. Persia, Byzantium's old rival, had been a recurring headache, but the stage was about to be taken by a new power, the Arabs. Starting in the middle of the 7th century, Islamic armies surged out of the Arabian Peninsula with speed and a theology that doubled as a marching rhythm. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, once integral sources of grain, money, and priests, slipped from Byzantine hands in a few decisive campaigns. The loss of Egypt was particularly brutal. It was the empire's breadbasket, and losing it meant that Constantinople, that city of mosaics and carefully planned processions, had to start rationing its culinary dreams. Heraclius, a soldier emperor of unusual energy, rode into the crisis like someone who mistook the empire for a horse that could be whipped into health. He reorganized the army, adopted new tactics, and, for a time, pressed back against Persian advances. He also introduced administrative reforms meant to make provincial defense more coherent. Yet the Arab conquests, combined with internal strains, meant that much of the old imperial territory was gone. Heraclius famously exchanged letters with the caliphate and tried to preserve what remained. But he also returned home exhausted, muttering about the empire's theological and political puzzles like an elderly man who'd been handed a Rubik's Cube after an all-night session of bad ideas. By the end of the 7th century, Byzantium had transformed. The Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake. It had become a contested basin. The empire was smaller, scrappier, and more intensely focused on surviving with elegance. The thematic system emerged, provinces reorganized into military districts, themes, each with troops who both farmed and fought. It was a practical solution. Soldiers who grew their own food were less likely to desert, and local commanders could respond quickly to raids. The thematic change also meant the empire's center of gravity shifted. Constantinople remained the capital, the dazzling center where emperors received ambassadors and staged their divine rite like a fashion show. But much of the real political energy now throbbed in provincial towns and fortresses. Language and culture tightened into a Greek-inflected identity. Latin held a place in law and ceremony for a time. But Greek, the language of Homer, of Christian theologians, and of every frustrated provincial official who had to read an emperor's decree, became the empire's heart language. Byzantium, in other words, kept Rome's silhouette, but spoke Greek, painted Christian icons with Roman gravitas, and developed a court culture that delighted in titles and bureaucracy. Titles multiplied like clergy at a synod: strategos, patrikios, magister, logothete. Each had a sash, a desk, and likely a small legion of subordinates who could sign things on his behalf. The court itself was theater. An emperor's entrance into the Chrysotriklinos, the golden reception hall, was a choreography of power. Protocols were rigid, pageantry was precise, and insult could be a capital offense if delivered at a banquet. The emperor sat under the cloth of state, wearing robes that spoke about legitimacy, divine favor, and the personal laundry problems of the imperial household. Guests walked away with gifts, favors, and occasionally, a scar from a ceremonial dagger that had been left on the table for dramatic effect. The palace never slept, it only napped with its eyes open. And then there were the emperors, a gallery of personalities so diverse that no reality TV show could hope to compete. Some were philosophers wedded to doctrine, others were soldiers who liked the feel of a spear, and a few were simply competent administrators who understood that stability was harder work than conquest. There were also a handful of emperors who demonstrated a particular talent for turning their reigns into footnotes. Murder, palace coups, and dynastic marriages were all standard operating procedures. A legitimate claim to the throne could be forged with marriage, bribery, or a well-timed military endorsement, sometimes all three. The 8th and 9th centuries, this is where the first part of our story is headed, would bring more drama, the second wave of iconoclasm, fierce showdowns with Balkan tribes, and the slow, stubborn flowering of Byzantine art and literature that would eventually become legendary. But before that, there were the cultural survivals that preserved Byzantium's identity. Monasteries became more than religious retreats. They were repositories of learning, scriptoria where monks copied books, and sometimes the moral conscience of the empire. Monks argued with emperors. Some emperors listened, many did not. The church and state in Byzantium were like co-parents with mismatched temperaments, sometimes collaborative, sometimes adversarial, and always dramatic. Economically, Byzantium did something few empires could. It created a currency that worked. The gold solidus, also called the numisma, became a near-universal token of trust. When Byzantine merchants sailed across the Mediterranean to Alexandria, to Venice, to Baghdad, their purses were heavy with gold that everyone accepted with a satisfying clink. This financial reliability made Constantinople a hub of trade. Silk, spices, grain, and ideas flowed through its markets. Merchants from Italy, the Levant, and beyond clustered in the great markets. The city's imperial granaries and clever systems kept the capital fed even when provinces faltered. It was not magic, it was organization, naval power, and a network of trade agreements that sometimes involved awkward dinners with pirates and erstwhile enemies. Art thrived in a tone that mixed piety and extravagance. Mosaics glittered on church walls as if the saints were forever winking at visitors. Icons were painted with a discipline that made faces both human and uncanny. Byzantine literature, too, found a confident voice. Chroniclers wrote with sarcasm and moral indignation. Panegyrists lauded emperors with florid hyperbole, and poets occasionally reminded the court that the gods, or God, had a sense of humor with a mean streak. Daily life for ordinary Byzantines was a mixture of toil and spectacle. Urban life in Constantinople offered markets, baths, and a social density that could be enchanting or suffocating, depending on your tolerance for crowds and pigeons. Rural life was vast and hard. Peasants worked the land, paid taxes, and prayed that the local magnate would show mercy. Women managed households, sometimes ran businesses, and occasionally rose to positions of power and influence that shocked contemporary observers. Slavery existed, but local and familial bonds complicated the institution in ways that historians still debate. Everyday faith, processions, saints' feast days, and neighborhood devotions knitted communities together. When disaster came, they prayed. When triumph came, they celebrated with a ritualistic flair. All of these pieces, law, theology, military adaptation, art, trade, and the absurd grind of palace politics, combined into what we call Byzantium, an empire that refused tidy labels. It was Roman in its law, Greek in its soul, Christian in its theology, and medieval in its methods. It clung to the idea of Roman continuity while reinventing itself to survive. This reinvention was not always graceful. It was often messy, occasionally cruel, and sometimes brilliant. We end this first chapter not with a tidy lesson, but with a cliffhanger. The empire that Constantine refashioned had survived plagues, fiscal crises, theological wars, and frontier losses by becoming more Byzantine, more complex, more ceremonial, and more adept at turning catastrophe into diplomatic choreography. The 7th and 8th centuries would test this adaptability further. Iconoclasm would burn like a religious fever. New enemies would probe the borders, and internal reforms would create structures that later emperors would both curse and thank. So, What do you think? If you had to pick one scandal, one emperor, or one mosaic to represent the soul of Byzantium, which would it be? Drop your pick in the comments now. I'll be reading and judging them for part 2. They tore down holy pictures, crowned fools, and somehow still managed to invent bureaucratic insults. Stick around for the next 10 seconds if you want to see emperors playing theological whack-a-mole while the empire tries not to leak into the sea. If that sounds chaotic, congratulations, you've passed the entry exam to Byzantine history. The second act opens with iconoclasm because Byzantium loved dramatic self-flagellation. In the early 8th century, emperors and clerics got into a philosophical fight that smelled suspiciously like politics with incense. One group argued that icons, the painted faces and gilded saints that brightened chapels, were a pious aid to devotion. The other insisted icons were idolatry, a scandal to true faith, and a convenient excuse for emperors to flex against monastic power bases. What followed was less an argument and more a cultural demolition. Derby, images smashed, monasteries pillaged, theologians exiled, and crowds in the street deciding which side would be fashionable this season. Emperors issued edicts like angry parents banning toys. Iconoclast policies were enforced with a zeal usually reserved for tax collectors and provincial gossip. Iconoclasm split families and communities. Imagine your grandmother's precious icon smashed by someone who claims they're doing you a favor in the name of purity. That emotional violence rippled through Byzantine society. It also carved political lines. Some emperors used iconoclasm to break the power of monasteries, those wealthy, land-owning, morally indignant institutions, while others saw it as a theological necessity. When the movement ended, temporarily in the mid-8th century and definitively in 843 with the triumph of orthodoxy celebrated under Empress Theodora, icon veneration returned with a vengeance. The aftermath wasn't just devotional reconciliation, it was a recalibration of power. The church's morale was restored, but the state had shown it could meddle in doctrine whenever control was needed. While Constantinople argued about sacred pictures, the empire's northern borders bled and hardened. The Bulgars, Slavs, and various Balkan tribes pressed down from the Danube, sometimes raiding, sometimes ruling, and sometimes being diplomatically outmaneuvered. Byzantium's relationship with Bulgaria is a love-hate epic with an emphasis on hate. There were alliances sealed by marriage, treaties written in grand hand, and wars where both sides proved stubborn endurance and occasionally poor taste in generals. Bulgarian rulers like Krum and later Simeon I were terrifyingly competent, carving out kingdoms and throwing down the gauntlet to Constantinople. Simeon even imagined himself as a Byzantine-style emperor. His court adopted Byzantine ceremonial, which is historically adorable and also strategically smart. As the 9th and 10th centuries dawned, Byzantium produced a solution every faltering superpower dreams of: cultural renaissance without the messy glue of territorial expansion. Call it the Macedonian Renaissance, not because Macedonians ran it, the dynasty came from Anatolia, but because the era's emperors revived learning, law, church life, and administrative competence, like frustrated gardeners resurrecting a once glorious hedge. Emperors such as Basil I and Basil II staked claims to legitimacy through reforms, patronage, and ruthless efficiency. They were also oddly talented at fielding competent generals and administrators, a combination that would deliver both military victories and tasty court gossip. This was a period when Byzantine chancelleries churned out literature, chronicles, and legal compilations. The revival saw the flowering of classical learning reinterpreted through Christian sensibilities. Students studied Homer and church fathers in the same breath, which made for education that was simultaneously pious and excellent at clipping the wings of bad rhetoric. Monks copied manuscripts with the grim dedication of artisans who knew the empire's continuity depended on the survival of texts. Craftsmen in workshops created icons, textiles, and goldwork so fine they would later embarrass many modern antique dealers. Militarily, Byzantium tightened its belt and took its revenge. The army, having been reorganized into more flexible units over the previous centuries, returned to form. Generals like Nikephoros Phokas and John Tzimiski spearheaded campaigns in the east that reclaimed territory from states and dynasties that had once seemed inexorable. The frontier shifted. Muslim emirates that had been confidently looting the peripheries now found themselves on the wrong end of Byzantine cavalry charges. The empires regained vigor in Anatolia, and the Levant created a sense, however temporary, that Byzantium could again be a decisive Mediterranean power. If there is a single character who embodied both brilliance and grimness, it was Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer. He reigned for decades and specialized in administrative and military perfectionism. Basil's obsession with control extended to tax reform, army discipline, and a hazardously thorough approach to enemies. He famously or infamously blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners following a victory over Tsar Samuel, sending them home 2 by 2 so that each man would lead his blinded companion. It's the kind of act that ensures historical notoriety, efficient, brutal, and efficient again. Basil's rule left the empire territorially enlarged and financially stable. His success showed the world, and the Byzantine elite, that long-term competence could outdo sudden brilliance. It also left behind a bureaucratic apparatus and a set of expectations about imperial leadership that no subsequent ruler would match easily. Trade and diplomacy were the other pillars of the era. Constantinople's markets glowed with silks, spices, and coin. Venetian and Genoese merchants began to loom larger, negotiating privileges that would later be politically explosive. Byzantium played an intricate diplomatic game with Western Europe, the Muslim world, and steppes peoples, marriages, treaties, and briberies woven like a net. The diplomatically savvy could get gifts, mercenaries, or peace without war. The less savvy found themselves in troublesome treaties that read like legal traps for the unwary. But no empire stays eternally on the rise. Internal problems accumulated like rust in a fine machine. Tax burdens grew under the weight of armies and opulent court life. Wealth concentrated in a narrow elite, creating resentments in the provinces. Powerful magnates, provincial aristocrats, started to act like petty monarchs, building regional power bases that thinned imperial authority. Corruption and stagnation crept in, especially during weaker reigns. Factionalism at court intensified. Eunuchs, bureaucrats, generals, and clerics formed shifting alliances like seasonal insects with dramatic mating rituals. Externally, the world creaked in ways that would reshape Byzantium's fate. The Seljuk Turks arrived in the late 11th century with horse archery speed and a hunger for land. They were the new master class of mobile warfare. Light cavalry, rapid strikes, and a strategic patience that mocked traditional heavy infantry lines. At the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the empire's army, under Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, suffered a catastrophic defeat against the Seljuks. Manzikert is often framed as the day Anatolia began its slow, tragic slide out of Byzantine hands, and in many ways that's true. However, the loss was as much political as military. Court intrigue, poor logistics, and factional betrayal magnified the battlefield disaster into a systemic crisis. After Manzikert, Anatolia's countryside faced depopulation. Local lords turned into warlords, and a refugee tide pushed into Constantinople and other coastal cities. The empire's manpower base shrank just as the need for soldiers surged, creating a vicious feedback loop. Emperors attempted to field mercenary armies, negotiate with new powers, or grant lands to warriors who would settle and defend. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. The state's capacity to exercise tight control loosened like a tunic after a feast. Into this breach stepped Western Europe, not as friend but as complex opportunist. Appeals for help to reclaim lost Christian lands combined with papal ambitions and the restless energies of European knights produced the Crusades. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, began as a messy, tragic, and occasionally heroic episode full of religious fervor, plunder, and poorly coordinated armies. Byzantium's relationship with the Crusaders was ambivalent. Emperors wanted help against the Seljuks, but feared Western armies that often had more appetite for tribute than for strategic cooperation. The Crusaders' capture of Jerusalem in 1099 shocked Byzantium, not least because the crusading armies treated alliances and diplomacy as optional extras. The arrival of the Crusaders also meant that Byzantium had to negotiate with a new set of quasi-independent polities in the Levant. Its emperors tried to play a game of influence. They provided supplies and sometimes guided Crusader aims, but their ultimate objective, the restoration of Byzantine authority in the region, was frequently undermined by Western city-states and adventurers with differing goals. Venice and Genoa grew in wealth and influence, their navies becoming indispensable to Mediterranean trade and occasional military ventures. The maritime republic's privileges, however, laid the groundwork for long-term dependency. Byzantium increasingly relied on Venetian ships, and Venetians increasingly had leverage over Byzantine economics and politics. Culturally, these centuries were paradoxically brilliant. Orthodox spirituality matured with new liturgical forms, mystics, and theological works. Monasticism produced not only saints, but scholars. Meanwhile, Constantinople remained a center of artistic innovation. Manuscripts, icons, and architecture continued to evolve in styles that balanced classical heritage with medieval Christian symbolism. The empire cultivated an identity shaped by ceremony, legal tradition, and theological orthodoxy, a self-image of continuity in a world that was changing fast. Social tensions, however, simmered. Urban populations swelled with refugees and displaced peoples. Rural communities suffered from raids and poor harvest. The empire introduced land grants and military colonies to stabilize regions, but these measures often eroded peasants' rights and birthed a semi-feudal tangled web of service obligations. The class divide sharpened. Wealthy landowners and courts were cosmopolitan and cultured. Provincial peasants and soldiers faced daily precarity. Occasional revolts punctured imperial complacency. When harvests failed or taxes rose, crowds took to the streets and sometimes dragged emperors off to the chopping block. The empire had developed institutional responses, laws, courts, and administrative tricks, but these occasionally failed to match the speed of social unrest. By the end of the 11th century, Byzantium resembled a prizefighter who'd won glorious rounds, but taken blows that left permanent scars. The Macedonian Renaissance had produced great lawgivers and conquerors. The 11th century's problems had underscored the fragility of success. The combination of external pressure from Seljuks and Normans, internal fragmentation, and the growing arrogance of maritime republics meant Constantinople walked a diplomatic tightrope. It was rich in ceremonial, strong in culture, and weakened in military manpower and political cohesion. The second act closes with a sense of exhausted resilience and ominous foreshadowing. Byzantium had proved its genius for reinvention. It could heal after plagues, reorganize after defeats, and produce a culture of astonishing depth. Yet the cracks were widening. New powers tested the edges. Internal strains eroded old strengths. The very mechanisms that had preserved the empire, bureaucracy, ceremony, and learned elites, were not always nimble enough to respond to the military and economic shocks of a changing medieval world. Before we move on to the next act, where the Crusaders, Venetians, and internal intrigue collide in spectacularly Byzantine ways, drop a line in the comments. Which Byzantine victory or disaster do you want blown up into slow-motion gossip next? Basil II's blind justice, the spectacle of Manzikert, or the first awkward handshake between Constantinople and the Crusader princes? Pick one and prepare for character assassination, historical sass, and the occasional moral lecture. Imagine the city that survived emperors, earthquakes, and theological takeovers being handed a guidebook titled How to Lose an Empire in 3 Crusades, then watching the main character read it out loud while sipping tea. Ready? The early 1200s opened like a tragicomic play with terrible timing and worse decisions. The 4th Crusade should have gone to Jerusalem. Instead, it detoured through Venice, bribery, and a family feud, and ended at Constantinople. Because why not? The crusading lords, led by people who thought diplomacy was a form of theft, arrived with swords, piety, and a short-term memory for treaties. Phoenicians arrived with a ledger, and the Byzantines arrived with the kind of internal division that looks tasteful on an imperial seal, but fatal on a battlefield. The result was the most spectacular instance of irony the medieval world had ever filmed: Latin Christians sacking the Christian capital. Byzantium's rich, saffron-lit courts and dazzling reliquaries were looted not by pagans but by men who kept telling God they were restoring Christendom while their ships were quietly loading mosaic panels. When the cross-bearers breached the city and the smoke rose over Hagia Sophia's golden mosaics, the empire didn't just lose territory, it lost its center of gravity and, for a generation, its dignity. The Latin Empire, 1204 to 1261, was established like a sunburn on the rump of a once proud beast, painful, embarrassing, and oddly persistent. Several Greek successor states popped up like determined mushrooms. the Empire of Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. Each claimed legitimacy and each performed the rituals of rulership, coronations, decrees, and the occasional assassination with grim enthusiasm. The noble families fractured into regional dynasts who styled themselves rulers because the word emperor now came with a higher risk of being trampled by cavalry. But the story of 1204 isn't only tragedy, it's also stubborn improvisation. In Nicaea, a line of rulers, and most notably Michael VIII Palaiologos, nurtured the idea that Constantinople could and should be retaken. They cultivated relations, patched alliances, and bided their time like chess players, hiding both pawns and resentment. Michael was not merely a general, he was a political surgeon, stitching together marriages, bribery, and military engagements until the Latin presence looked tired and corrupt. In 1261, having planned like someone who once ran a tax office for sadness, he entered the city again, stealthily, in the night, through a gate left unguarded, and re-established the Byzantine Empire under the Palaiologan dynasty. The crowd probably applauded with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The emperor had returned. The problem was, 30-odd years of Latin governance had hollowed out the city's resources, and the world outside had not paused to wait for Byzantine morale to recover. The Palaiologan restoration was a masterclass in bittersweet victory. Constantinople was back on the map, but the map had changed. The economics of the Mediterranean favored the maritime republics, Venice and Genoa, and they had not been gentle guest stars. Venice, having enjoyed privileges and profits during the Latin period, had a taste for influence that outlived its taste for gratitude. Genoa, not to be outdone, carved its own enclaves. Byzantium needed the ships and credit the Italians provided, but that very need made the empire dependent. Trade treaties turned into leverage. Venetian quarters in the city were like economic wedges. Genoese merchants in Galata were like well-armed wedges. The imperial treasury thinned while merchants became alarmingly good at invoicing. Politically, Michael VIII attempted to re-secure the empire through a mixture of military action, diplomacy, administrative reform, and in a move that made theologians sigh dramatically, church politics. He attempted compromises with Rome, not out of piety, but out of political calculation. If Western Christendom recognized him, his rule would be more secure. That calculus produced enemies at home, conservative clerics, monks who had not forgiven the icon-smashing era, or the Latin pillage, saw union with Rome as compromise to the point of betrayal. Michael's willingness to negotiate church union provoked riots and conspiracies. The empire had been restored, but now it had to manage the taste of betrayal on its tongue. Every diplomatic handshake felt like a potential stab in the back. By the late 13th century, the Palaiologan restoration had produced something complicated, a cultural flowering that thrived amid political atrophy. Call it the Palaiologan Renaissance, a bittersweet aesthetic revival where mosaics glowed anew, texts were copied with meticulous care, and scholarship re-emerged as a kind of spiritual fitness regimen. Artists and scholars worked with the conviction of people who knew the library might not last forever. They embroidered liturgies and revised classical texts, producing a cultural output that later generations would look at with complicated nostalgia. The empire's churches and monasteries became sanctuaries of learning. Even small courts tried to outdo each other in patronage. If you wanted to make something eternal, Byzantium was the place to commission it. Yet culture does not pay soldiers, and the Ottoman clock, previously a faint ticking in Anatolia, began to sound louder. After the Mongol fragmentation of some steppe pressure, numerous Turkish beyliks rose in Anatolia. Among them, the Ottomans advanced with a mix of tenacity, strategic marriage, and timing so opportunistic it could be taught in diplomatic schools. Byzantium, still dependent on mercenaries and increasingly on Italian naval power, found itself squeezed by land and sea. Local magnates who once fought for imperial honor now negotiated their own terms with Turkish princes. Some Byzantine cities paid tribute to survive. Others endured gradual Islamization. Many slumped into administrative neglect. The map of Anatolia, the empire's old heartland, quietly changed its hues. Fields that once supplied Constantinople filled with new landlords, new languages, and new loyalties. Internal rot made the external pressure worse. The 14th century became a Byzantine soap opera with swords. Emperors came and went, often in a blur of coups and assassinations. Look up the names of Andronikos II and Andronikos III, and you'll find a family drama complete with fiscal mismanagement, a generational conflict, and misplaced trust in mercenary companies. When emperors started hiring foreign companies to do their fighting, they invited trouble. The Catalan Company, a group of battle-hardened mercenaries, arrived like a traveling circus of blades and decided to run their own season in the eastern provinces. Hired to fight Turks, they instead carved out lands, pillaged, and occasionally offered the empire the kind of service that would be called counterproductive in medieval diplomatic manuals. Civil wars between rival claimants bled the state dry. Families turned against each other, and regions that might have cooperated to resist the Ottomans instead competed over how to invoice each other for protection. The imperial navy shrank from a proud fleet into a collection of hired sails. Byzantine diplomacy swung between witty bribery and desperate pleadings. The court's once glorious bureaucracy, great in theory, clogged in practice, could not muster the resources required to keep the frontiers intact. Men who had once planned sieges and legal codes now argued about precedents in court, and who wore the more impressive purple. The purple, once a symbol of august authority, increasingly looked like a costume at a political funeral. The Black Death, mid-14th century, added an extra stroke of cruelty. Plague fever did not care for arguments about legitimacy or the sanctity of icons. It killed clerics who kept records and peasants who worked fields. Where there was already a manpower shortage due to lost Anatolian provinces and internal exile of productive classes, the plague made the demographic problem structural. Tax revenues collapsed, urban centers shrank. The social fabric, already frayed by economic inequity, stretched until it snapped in places. Labor shortages gave some peasants leverage, but the ensuing tightening measures by landlords and state authorities often worsened tensions. Instead of long-term restructuring, the empire repeatedly applied short-term fixes that resembled medical tinctures for a structural cancer. While the empire struggled, cultural life remained paradoxically luminous. Hesychasm, a mystical tradition emphasizing inner prayer, found traction among clerics and monks, offering a spiritual remedy for a world that otherwise felt terminally messy. Theology produced brilliant minds who argued about prayer and the nature of God, with a level of intensity that made court politics look petty by comparison. In cities like Thessalonica, literature and iconography continued to be produced with exquisite care. The art of manuscript illumination went on as if to say, even if the ship is leaking, let us at least embroider a map. Patrons still funded music and drama. Liturgical life pulsed on in a way that comforted the surviving elite and occasionally enraged the reformers. The 14th century saw the empire become a mosaic of dependencies and small sovereignties. The imperial court negotiated with Serbian czars, Bulgarian rulers, Genoese and Venetian merchants, and Turkish beys. Treaties were signed and broken with casualness that grew more common with each failed harvest. To a chronicler, this period must have seemed like watching a juggler lose one ball, then another, and then try to sell tickets to the audience while muttering about strategy. Byzantium was increasingly a diplomatic animal, surviving not by land-grabbing conquest but by treaties, marriages, and the occasional cynical alliance. One of the darker turns came with the rise of semi-autonomous magnates and despots. Individuals, often provincial governors or members of the imperial family, created their own principalities, the despotate of Epirus, the despotate of the Morea, and others. These rulers maintained the rituals of Byzantium, courtly titles, liturgies, and dynastic marriages. Yet in practice, they ran local affairs with the independence of small kings. Some were effective, bringing a degree of local stability. Others became petty tyrants, exploiting peasants and hiring thuggish bands to enforce taxes. The empire, once the fountainhead of administration and culture, had fragmented into pieces that retained Byzantine forms, but not always Byzantine loyalties. All of this left Constantinople oddly theatrical, still magnificent, still hosting imperial ceremonies, but ever more symbolic than strategic. The city remained an attraction of pilgrims, scholars, and travelers. Its architectural heritage continued to awe, but the hearing room for imperial authority had fewer instruments to conduct power. Where once the emperor had commanded armies and taxed provinces, now he bargained for ships and trade credits. Attendance at court still mattered. Its patrons still saw value in being seen in purple. But the real power increasingly rested with whoever controlled the purse strings, the mercenaries, or the harbors. Yet Byzantium refused to die gracefully. It practiced resilience the way a scar practices stubbornness. Emperors still issued edicts, scholars still copied manuscripts, and guilds still argued about the price of bread. All the small, repetitive actions that together constitute life. The empire made it the best possible increments of survival, negotiated truces, temporary alliances, and local defensive efforts. But the axis of decline, military weakness, economic dependence, internal division, continued to rotate toward crisis. By the middle of the 14th century, a new contender in Anatolia, the Ottomans, had coalesced into a potent polity. They were not yet the empire that would take Constantinople in 1453, but their sting, rapid cavalry raids, shrewd sieges, and a talent for absorbing local elites, had become an existential threat. Byzantium's survival strategy of playing one power against another began to fail in the face of a neighbor who could offer continuity to conquered elites, and who did not fear the ideological contradictions of incorporating different peoples. We reached the late 14th century with a Byzantine state that was at once cultured, exhausted, clever, and mortally compromised. The drama had become refined to a set of recurring motifs, a brilliant cultural output shading into nostalgia, a poverty in military manpower compensated by rhetorically exuberant diplomatic gestures, and a social order trying to maintain hierarchies, while the economic base shifted underfoot. The empire had learned how to survive catastrophes, plagues, sackings, civil wars, but not how to transform itself into something capable of reversing a long-term strategic decline. So, pick your favorite kind of historical schadenfreude and write it in the comments. Want a slow-motion takedown of the Catalan Company? A snark-filled elegy for the Latin emperors? Or a courtroom-style dissection of Michael VIII's church diplomacy? Say the word, and we'll stage the next act with more sarcasm, more caricature, and, if you're lucky, even more tragic irony. Imagine a city that has survived emperors' murders, earthquakes that rearranged the marble like bad hair, and theological brawls so vicious they would make modern pundits blush. Now imagine that city staring down a new kind of army with thunderbolts, made of iron, and a ruler who treated destiny like a to-do list. Stay with me for a minute. This is the endgame of an empire that could never resist a good cliffhanger. By the mid-15th century, Byzantium was an old book with many pages torn out. It still smelled of incense and pages, and its scriptoria still produced texts with the dignity of monks who decided beauty was a form of protest. But the empire's margins had been eaten away and its treasures spent in the constant arithmetic of survival. The palace ceremonies continued in the capital, Constantinople, that stubborn, mosquito-friendly rock on the Bosporus, because making a spectacle out of power is cheaper than having power, and also because habits die harder than states. The emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, was a man who inherited a job whose job description included be brave and accept unpaid invoices. He was not wild-eyed or victorious. He was a last-stand professional, the sort of ruler who understood that dignity and defeat often traveled in the same coach. On the opposite bank of the historical ledger sat Mehmed II, not yet nicknamed Conqueror, but certainly someone with a plan. Mehmed inherited an Ottoman state that had been clever and patient, expanding quietly like moss that eventually cracks the stone. The Ottomans had absorbed warriors, administrators, and technologies. They had learned the art of taking a city not just by battering its walls, but by outbidding its friends and isolating its allies. Mehmed, then a young sultan in his 20s, resolved to finish what generations had chipped at, to turn Constantinople from an untouchable capital into a neighborhood in his dominion, with all the administrative convenience that entailed. The geography favored Constantinople's myth of invulnerability: triple walls on the land side, a sea chain across the Golden Horn, the Bosporus narrow strait, natural defenses that had repelled countless sieges. The Theodosian walls were not mere architecture, they were a psychological contract between the empire and eternity. People believed the walls were eternal, and thus they behaved accordingly. But by 1453, the walls were old and understaffed. Years of reduced manpower, economic decline, and previous sackings had hollowed out the city's defenses. Where there used to be 6 men per tower, there were now 2 and a baker who was very good at throwing loaves. Mehmed's plan combined the new and the ancient. He gathered a vast army that by contemporary accounts outnumbered the defenders by many times. He built a fleet to blockade the city from the sea and most famously hired a master cannon maker named Orban. Orban produced artillery that looked like a heresy to classical siegecraft, monstrous bronze cannon that hurled stone the size of carts. The cannons were less accurate than modern tanks and required a small international bureaucracy to operate, but they had an unmistakable psychological effect. The sound of stone hitting masonry was a new punctuation mark in the sentence of siege. When Orban's great bombard began to chew at the walls, it supplied what no cavalry or catapult had in centuries: industrialized destruction. The Byzantines, who had argued theology in perfect marble halls, now heard physics argue back. The defenders, led by Constantine XI and bolstered by a ragtag coalition of local levies, Venetian and Genoese sailors, and foreign volunteers, numbered only a few thousand. Among them, the Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani commanded the landward defense with a discipline that turned panicked volunteers into a fighting edge. For a while, the defenders made the walls seem like they were the ones doing the pressing, repelling assaults, and even inflicting setbacks on the Ottoman engineers. Giustiniani's presence was a tactical advantage of the sort Byzantium had not enjoyed for a while. Professional soldiery under talented command. But in siegecraft, as in life, luck is often disguised as logistics. Giustiniani was wounded. Accounts vary, but he was struck in late April, and his absence, whether temporary or prolonged, left a gap that morale struggled to bridge. Mehmed, practical and impatient, understood that breaking the walls would be costly and unpredictable, so he layered strategies. He built siege towers, dug mines, exploited political divisions in the city, and, in a piece of guerrilla naval theater, hauled ships overland to bypass the chain across the Golden Horn. For a few cinematic days, Ottoman galleys slid over logs across a shallow isthmus and splashed into the Horn behind the chain, creating a new front. The image of ships rolled on logs, shepherds of steel, is the sort of logistical flourish that would later seed countless paintings and chronicles. It was a triumph of planning and morale, and it showed that the Ottomans were not merely a force of numbers, but also of imagination. Inside the city, time was a currency squandered on arguments and prayer. The populace was a river of fear, devotion, and a resigned humor appropriate for people who had outlived many catastrophes. Men who had been scribes and candlemakers found themselves hauling stones and bartering with captains for a place on the wall. Women tended to houses and to wounded strangers. The churches refused to stop being luminous, and the mosaics, faces and tesserae that had watched emperors come and go for a millennium, watched the city's last stand with the same luminous indifference of saints who had seen worse. Pilgrims prayed, vendors traded last supplies, and chroniclers kept writing. For chroniclers often believe that words have a way of sanctifying the present. Diplomacy in the months before the siege reads like a master class in missed opportunities. Constantinople had tried to bribe or entrust its survival to Western powers. Popes sent appeals, and Western princes issued moral support and occasionally feeble fleets. Venice, whose merchants often saw Byzantium as both a partner and a competitor, sent token assistance but hesitated at full commitment. Genoa's interests in Galata complicated alignments. The Western European polities remained distracted by their own quarrels. The Byzantine pleas for a crusade came as ancient entreaties for a powerful friend to help, but the Middle Ages were not short on irony. The Fourth Crusade had sacked Constantinople only 2 centuries earlier, and old grievances made new alliances brittle. The West's reluctance to commit full force and time sealed a diplomatic failure, almost as much as the guns sealed a military one. When the final assault came on May 29, 1453, it was not a single cinematic moment, but an all-day ordeal in which tides of men clashed against masonry, outworks, and will. Mehmed ordered attacks along multiple points of the walls while intensifying bombardment. The defenders fired off every last arrow, pitch, and prayer. Giustiniani, wounded and absent, was acutely missed. In one section of wall, the stones gave way under a concentrated attack combined with undermining. In another, exhausted men simply could not be reconstituted quickly enough. Once a breach appeared, the psychology of defense became the most dangerous enemy. Walls that had been defended for centuries could feel suddenly like sieves. Constantine XI is central to the myth of the fall. Contemporary accounts describe him as having donned civilian clothes to move among and calm the citizens in a final act of mixed dignity and cunning. Legend has it he removed his imperial regalia, told his surviving officers to save their lives, and then charged the enemy in full armor, becoming one of those almost operatic figures whose death becomes part of national identity. He died in battle on that final day, and his body, if found, was never conclusively identified. The last emperor's death became a story the way epic poems require heroes, unclear, noble, and emblematic. For Greeks and Orthodox Christians afterward, Constantine was a martyr king. For the Ottomans, a brave opponent who had been defeated by fate and cannon. Then the sack. For a medieval city, a sack is both practical and theatrical. Looting, violence, and the reallocation of property happen with a grim legality reminiscent of fiscal audits with swords. Constantinople's fall involved killing and enslavement, as well as administrative measures. Mehmed, a ruler with an eye for long-term governance, eventually took steps to restore order, repopulate the city, and incorporate it into an Ottoman imperial framework. He declared a policy of religious tolerance in a pragmatic sense. The Patriarchate was eventually re-established under Ottoman patronage. Many Greek inhabitants were allowed to stay in practice, and new populations, Turks, Jews fleeing Iberian, persecution decades later, and others, would repopulate the ruined neighborhoods. Hagia Sophia, that giant book of mosaics in marble, was quickly converted into a mosque, its Christian iconography plastered over or repurposed, which is to say the building's meaning shifted along with the city's sovereignty. The immediate aftermath was not an apocalypse of cultural annihilation, but a violent reordering. The Byzantine administrative maps did not vanish in a day. They dissolved over decades as the Ottomans reorganized territories, absorbed elites, and offered pragmatic continuities. The Despotate of Morea in the Peloponnese endured for a few years before being taken in 1460. The Empire of Trebizond held out until 1461 when Mehmed's generals closed the last independent Byzantine polity on the Black Sea coast. These residual states were like stubborn barnacles on a fallen ship, tenacious, picturesque, and eventually removed. The fall's ripple effects were profound. For Europe, the sudden availability of Greek scholars and manuscripts, men who could read Plato in the original and who carried hitherto unknown commentaries, fueled intellectual currents that the West called the Renaissance. Scholars fled westward from Constantinople in the years and decades after 1453, and their books and teaching fed an appetite for classical learning freshly unfiltered by centuries of Byzantine interpretative layers. Whether or not Constantinople's fall caused the Renaissance is a historian's favorite game of hat-passing. More defensively, the fall accelerated the movement of texts and minds to Western centers, which contributed to a revival of classical learning and humanist studies. Economically and geopolitically, the Ottoman control of the Bosporus realigned trade. The Mediterranean's commercial gravity gradually shifted, and maritime powers like Portugal and Spain, pressing for new routes to Asia, found both motivation and opportunity in the altered map of trade routes. In a grim bit of historical irony, the loss of Constantinople as a Christian bulwark prompted European rulers to look seaward, and the age of exploration opened doors that would remake the globe in ways no medieval scribe could have imagined. For Byzantium's memory, the fall was not an afterthought, but a living narrative. Orthodox liturgy and popular stories preserve the sense of a lost empire. In Russian politics and later Greek nationalism, Constantinople lingered as an emblem of imperial continuity and religious destiny. The empire's institutions, law, think the Justinianic Code, court ritual, administrative sophistication, and theological traditions continued to shape the Eastern Christian world and the Ottoman state that inherited many Byzantine bureaucrats and legal practices. Byzantine artistry influence survived in icons and liturgy, while architectural legacies appeared in Ottoman masterpieces that sometimes borrowed Byzantine forms. Mosques that echoed domes and buttresses originally designed for a different theology. What is the moral of Byzantium's final act? There is no single moral, only a dozen ironies. A culture that had been astonishingly resilient finally met a modernity of gunpowder, and a neighbor whose ambition outpaced the capital's capacity to pay mercenaries and patch alliances. Byzantium was not doomed by decadence alone. It was undone by a cocktail of long-term attrition, short-term missteps, diplomatic exhaustion, and the arrival of technologies and polities that rewrote the rules of empire. Yet it deserves a strange kind of respect. To persist for more than 1,000 years as a political identity, a set of institutions, and a cultural project is a feat of organizational stubbornness unmatched in most histories. And the feeling afterwards? Grief, certainly, for those who lost homes and lives, but also an oddly complicated admiration. The city that fell was not the whole of Byzantium. Its culture continued in monasteries, courts, and people who carried its liturgies and laws into new political frameworks. Constantinople might have been conquered, but the Byzantine legacy continued to live, reconfigure, and haunt empires and ideologies that followed. So here we are. The curtain falls on the last chapter of the Roman story. An empire that began with Constantine's audacious rebranding and ended beneath cannon thunder and pragmatic governance. If you want soap opera breakdowns, we have palace coups and tragic heroes. If you want tactical drama, we have the hauled ships and the enormous cannon. If you want cultural elegy, we have monks copying manuscripts by candlelight as the city burns. Which angle do you want us to bludgeon into history's gossip column next? Drop in the comments. Do you want a slow-motion roast of Mehmed's PR strategy, a dramatic reconstruction of Constantine V's last day, or a deep dive into the manuscripts that fled west and changed Europe? Tell me which character or moment to eviscerate with historical sass. I'll pick the juiciest and turn it into the next video chapter.